Welcome to the medieval kitchen, where every meal was a gamble and every spark a potential eulogy. In a world before gas stoves, fire extinguishers, or any understanding of what the word flammable actually meant, cooking wasn't just an act of sustenance. It was a daily brush with the divine, often accompanied by third-degree burns and a thin veil of smoke. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why medieval cooks needed more prayers than recipes, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. At the heart of it all, literally, was the open hearth, the centerpiece of every medieval kitchen. Not a stove, not a range, just an open, roaring fire planted squarely in the middle of the room like a hungry dragon that occasionally decided to belch, and that was considered good design. If you were particularly lucky, the hearth might be raised slightly off the floor. If not, congratulations, you now had a toddler-height fire pit surrounded by flammable floor rushes and strategically placed wooden beams. No walls? No problem. No chimney? Also no problem, because it turns out that ventilation was still a twinkle in the eye of some future architect. The smoke was expected to just sort of figure itself out. Maybe it floated up through a hole in the roof. Maybe it wafted into the next room. Maybe it simply sat there in your lungs until your body gave up and decided it had better things to do. And let's not forget that medieval kitchens weren't always tucked away in some cozy stone-walled corner of the manor. Sometimes they were separate buildings entirely, because even the medieval mind thought, this giant unpredictable fire that we use every day, maybe it shouldn't be attached to the sleeping quarters. Wise. But then again, in colder regions, the kitchen was the source of heat, so it doubled as a furnace, sauna, and occasional crematorium. There's a reason medieval clothes were loose-fitting, tight fabrics are hard to remove mid-combustion. Now, if you're imagining a serene cook lazily turning a spit while basking in the warm glow of the fire, I regret to inform you that reality looked more like a smoke-choked panic room with the threat of spontaneous combustion. Fires didn't exactly come with knobs. They were built by hand, lit with flint and tinder, maintained with careful wood placement, and stoked like your life depended on it. Which frankly it did. A fire that went out meant no food. A fire that flared too high meant no kitchen. And let's talk unpredictability. Wood burns unevenly. One log might crackle politely, the next might launch a rogue ember halfway across the room like it's auditioning for medieval fireworks night. Sparks were everywhere, embers rolled freely, flames licked at pot handles and curtain hems alike. Some kitchens had iron firebacks or stone surrounds to try to contain the inferno, but even those weren't guarantees. There are records of entire abbeys being reduced to ash because someone got distracted while boiling porridge. Cooks, who were generally underpaid, overworked, and constantly sweating, had to dance around these infernos with the grace of a ballerina and the caution of a bomb squad. They wore layers of wool and linen, which are famously not fire-resistant, and when accidents happened, there was no cold water tap to run to, no aloe vera in the cupboard. You either prayed, screamed, or both. In fact, many medieval prayers specifically included lines for protection from fire, which is suspiciously specific for a society that thought sneezing was caused by demons. The tools didn't help either. Cast iron pots and cauldrons were absurdly heavy, and you had to reach into the fire to adjust them. Ever tried rotating a cauldron full of meat stew with your bare hands while squinting through smoke and dodging sparks? That was Tuesday. Oh, and everything was hot pans, hooks, ladles, even the rock you sat on while tending the fire. The whole room was a red-hot game of don't touch that. And for those wondering, yes, things did catch on fire, often. Clothes, hair, benches, dogs, whatever. Many medieval buildings were timber-framed with thatched roofs, the architectural equivalent of building a kitchen out of gasoline-soaked hay. A fire in the kitchen was rarely just a kitchen fire. It could take down an entire village faster than you could say, was that smoke always there? So yes, recipes mattered, Ingredients mattered, but what medieval cooks really needed was divine intervention, a steady hand, and a miracle-resistant apron, and maybe a support group, because when your cooking technique relies on an uncontrollable inferno, your ventilation system is crack a window maybe, and your workplace hazard is death by soup pot, the last thing you're worrying about is seasoning. You're just trying not to become the appetizer, so you've survived the open hearth inferno without catching on fire. Congratulations, now comes the next challenge, actually cooking something. But don't bother asking for a recipe, because in the medieval kitchen, instructions weren't written, they were whispered, guessed, or just deeply felt in your soul. Welcome to the era of culinary jazz. In the Middle Ages, cooking was more oral tradition than science, passed down through generations like family secrets or curses. If your grandmother didn't teach you how to make that eel pie, you were out of luck, and if she did, chances are she taught you with such helpful phrases as, boil it until it's done, or just use what you've got, or the ever-reliable, when it smells right, it's ready. This wasn't a world of teaspoons and temperature control. There were no glossy food blogs, no top 10 mistakes everyone makes with pottage, and certainly no step-by-step instructional TikToks filmed in cozy cottagecore kitchens. Most people couldn't read, and even fewer had access to books. So how did anyone know how to cook anything? The answer is, they kind of didn't. Now for the noble or monastic elite, there were written cookbooks, if you could call them that. These were hefty manuscripts written in Latin or Old French, typically reserved for the wealthy, clergy, or deeply unfortunate monks tasked with feeding hundreds. But even these books weren't exactly helpful. They were vague, assuming the reader already knew the basics of cooking and the locations of several exotic ingredients only found 3 continents away. One such medieval cookbook, Le Viandier, written in the 14th century, contains gems like take meat, roast it well and serve it. A helpful reminder in case your original plan was to not cook it at all. Measurements in these texts were blissfully imprecise. A handful of breadcrumbs, it might say. Whose hand? A child's? A blacksmith's? Cook it until it's brown. Another might add. Under candlelight in a soot-stained room, everything was brown. Add good spices, one recipe advises. What counts as good? Were there bad spices? Were they being judged? This kind of ambiguity led to a lot of creative interpretation. Imagine trying to recreate a dish when your only instruction is take some meat, do something to it, and make it tasty. It's less of a recipe and more of a riddle. Medieval cooks had to rely on instinct, guesswork, and the occasional divine intervention, especially since the concept of consistent heat, cook time, or ingredient freshness was basically non-existent. But let's not forget the oral tradition, which was often just as confusing. Cooks trained through observation, watching their elders stir pots, gut fish, and whisper incantations, or possibly just swearing under their breath. It was learning by osmosis, with a side of burns and trial by fire, literally. And because nothing was standardized, the same dish could taste wildly different depending on who made it, what day of the week it was, and whether the cook was having a personal crisis. One cook's stew might be hearty and delicious. Another's might be slightly more feral, and nobody could tell you exactly why. This wasn't just limited to peasants either. Royal kitchens had their own version of chaos, even with access to spices, wine, rare meats, and entire staff hierarchies. Elite kitchens often cooked by feel. The result? Fancy dinners that looked extravagant but tasted like someone accidentally set the pantry on fire and just rolled with it. And then there's the fact that ingredients varied wildly. One chicken wasn't the same as another. One sack of flour might be coarse, another fine, and a third filled with something suspicious and alive. So when the recipe called for flour, it was really just asking you to take your chances. Imagine trying to bake bread with whatever mystery dust your neighbor sold you that morning. Add until it feels right, they said. Ignore the buzzing. Even time itself was vague in the kitchen. Recipes might say to cook for a while, or until the sun moves. That's not hyperbole. Sundials and shadows were actual tools in kitchens, which means if it was raining or cloudy, your dinner might just be eternally undercooked. And you better not sneeze or blink, because there went your timer. So when modern chefs brag about cooking from the heart, remember that medieval cooks invented the genre. They didn't follow recipes, they channeled them. They felt the food, they didn't measure, they guessed and hoped. Every meal was a leap of faith, and that faith often included a quick prayer that the meat wasn't rancid and the bread wouldn't explode. In a world where your only measuring tool was your own hand, your only clock was the sun, and your only seasoning was whatever didn't smell like feet, cooking was less about precision and more about surviving the process without weeping into the porridge. Because in the medieval kitchen, there were no guarantees, not of taste, not of safety, and definitely not of success. There was just you, the fire, and a suspiciously vague recipe written in a language you couldn't read.
Bon appétit.
In the grand tradition of medieval cooking, there was one universal truth: you ate what didn't kill you first. While modern kitchens obsess over freshness, expiration dates, and color-coded Tupperware systems, medieval cooks played a daily game of, is this food, or is this a biohazard? Spoiler, the answer was often both. Let's start with the basics. Preservation was more hope than science. Medieval Europe had no refrigeration, no vacuum sealing, and certainly no Best Buy stickers. The preservation methods that did exist were rudimentary at best: salting, smoking, pickling, drying, or just consuming it fast and praying harder. Salt was the MVP of medieval food preservation, and when we say salt, we mean buckets of it. Fish, pork, and even beef were buried in layers of salt like they were being offered to the gods of hypertension. This process could, in theory, keep meat edible for weeks or even months, but edible is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. By the time that salted cod made it to your plate, it was less fish and more crunchy salt-flavored leather. Smoking was also common, particularly with sausages and hams. The idea was to dry the meat and coat it in enough smoky essence to discourage bacteria and appetites. Think of it as medieval Febreze for protein. The result was meat that may have technically been safe, but tasted like it had been dragged through a fireplace and emotionally neglected. And then there was fermentation, that ancient, borderline magical process of controlled decay. Except in the Middle Ages, the controlled part was more wishful thinking than chemistry. Fermented fish in particular was a staple in Northern Europe, especially during long winters or religious fasting periods. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to store fish in a wooden barrel for several weeks, let it stew in its own juices, and then serve it with a straight face, congratulations, you've just unlocked the secret of medieval Lenten cuisine. But not everyone had access to the preserved stuff. The average peasant had to rely on what they could grow, forage, trap, or barter for. This meant meat might be days old, vegetables half frozen or worm-bitten, and cheese, well, let's just say if your cheese wasn't actively crawling, it was considered a good day. Cheese, once a beloved staple of the medieval diet, often walked a fine line between aged and possessed. Without modern techniques to control mold, many cheeses developed colorful spots, aggressive odors, and in some truly unlucky cases, legs. Some varieties, like Casumazu, a maggot-infested cheese still made in parts of Sardinia today, can trace their very ancient roots to this era. The idea was simple: if the worms liked it, it must be good, right? Bread, too, wasn't always safe. Grain storage was inconsistent and vulnerable to pests, mold, and rot. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grew on rye, could cause hallucinations, seizures, or even death, which meant that breakfast might come with a side of unintentional LSD trip. In fact, some scholars even theorized that ergot poisoning may have played a role in historical events like mass hysteria and dancing plagues. Yes, some people literally danced themselves to death, all because their sandwich turned into psychedelic chaos. And then we have spices. Today we use them to enhance flavor. In the Middle Ages, they were used to cover up the stench of despair. Spices like pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg were imported from far-flung lands at enormous cost. which meant only the wealthy could afford to season their slightly decomposing duck with something that vaguely resembled Christmas. Did the spices help? Sometimes. But as one medieval food historian put it, if your meat smells that bad, no amount of saffron is going to save you. Ironically, the worse the ingredient, the more elaborate the dish. Rather than toss out rotting meat, nobles would cook it with wine, vinegar, and every spice in the pantry until it was almost indistinguishable from something edible. The result was a dish that had the texture of a boot, the scent of perfume spilled on a corpse, and the price tag of a small horse. And they called it a feast. The sad truth is, food safety was a medieval myth. There were no food inspectors, no cleanliness ratings, and certainly no return policies. If your fish made you ill, you didn't complain, you just died quietly or blamed the nearest peasant woman for sorcery. To make matters worse, medieval belief systems didn't exactly help. People thought bad smells caused disease, not the bacteria producing the smell. So as long as you couldn't smell the danger thanks spices, you were good to go. This meant that food was judged by olfactory illusion, not logic. If it didn't knock you unconscious upon arrival, it passed the test. So how did anyone survive? Luck, mostly. That and incredibly resilient stomachs hardened by years of fungal bread and fermented fish surprises. People adapted. Their digestive systems became ironclad. Either that or they just didn't live long enough to notice the damage. Because in the medieval kitchen, if the food didn't come fresh, it came feral. And when your best preservation strategy is scrape off the green parts and cook it harder, well, let's just say seasoning becomes the least of your worries. So next time you grumble about that slightly bruised apple in your fridge, take a moment to remember that in the Middle Ages, bruised was a luxury. Everything else was audibly fermenting. Bon appetit and good luck. If you've ever complained about doing the dishes, consider this. In the medieval kitchen, the concept of clean was more of an urban legend than a daily practice. Sanitation didn't just take a back seat. It wasn't even in the carriage, because in the Middle Ages, kitchens weren't just dirty. They were health code violations waiting to happen if health codes existed. Let's begin with the obvious, smoke. In the beginning we discussed open hearths, but here's the next layer of horror. Those fires didn't just cook your food, they coated everything in soot. Walls, ceilings, cookware, people. The kitchen ceiling looked like someone had tried to barbecue a chimney. The pots were permanently blackened, and the cooks, they looked like they were prepping food during a volcanic eruption. If your fingers weren't grey with ash, were you even working? Now, you might be thinking, sure, it was smoky, but at least they had water to clean things, right? Technically, yes, but water wasn't exactly pristine. Most medieval kitchens didn't have running water, and the nearest source might be a well, a river, or if you were truly cursed, a rain barrel that doubled as mosquito daycare. The water could be cloudy, filled with sediment, or flavored with whatever upstream problem wandered into it that week. Spoiler, it was probably a cow. And even when water was available, it didn't mean people used it for cleaning. That was a luxury reserved for the rich or the wildly optimistic. Soap, meanwhile, was its own medieval mess. The average peasant soap was a greasy brick made from animal fat and ashes, with the scent of despair and exactly none of the effectiveness. It was used sparingly, if at all, and certainly not on anything you were about to eat off of. Utensils, assuming you had them, didn't fare much better. Spoons were shared, knives wiped on trousers, and plates were often made of wood, or if you were fancy, pewter that slowly poisoned you with lead. And cleaning these tools, that meant scraping them with whatever was nearby, a bit of straw, a dirty cloth, the hem of your apron, or sometimes just a hopeful stare. And if you were a commoner, you likely didn't have individual plates at all. You ate off trenchers, day-old bread, used as edible dinnerware. These were technically replaced each meal, unless someone forgot, which meant that sometimes your stew was served on a slice of sourdough that had already hosted 2 previous meals and 1 extremely confused fly. But wait, it gets worse. Surfaces, as in tables, counters, and anything your food touched, were suggestions, not sanitizable zones. Kitchen tables were rough-hewn wood, rarely wiped down, and often shared by people, animals, and whatever mystery goo had congealed there since last Tuesday. You could be gutting a fish, slicing turnips and shooing away a cat, all at the same time, and all on the same slab of wood. Speaking of animals, welcome to the rat problem. Every medieval kitchen came with its own unpaid rodent staff. Rats, mice, and weasels were frequent visitors, and they weren't just after crumbs, they were living in the cupboards. Cats were somewhat useful in keeping the numbers down, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. And sometimes the cats were the problem, jumping onto tables, licking leftover meat, and then sauntering away like they'd just contributed to the cooking. Flies were another issue. With no screens, no refrigeration, and plenty of rotting smells, kitchens were literal buffets for insects. A pot of stew might attract a small swarm by the time you turned your back. The solution? Cover it with a cloth and pretend that buzzing sound wasn't happening. As for hand washing, it existed in theory, especially among monks and upper-class households, but in practice it was inconsistent at best and laughably absent at worst. Peasant cooks often worked with hands that had already fed livestock, chopped wood, cleaned latrines, or all three. Then, without missing a beat, they'd reach right into the dough or start stuffing a goose. The idea of cross-contamination hadn't been invented yet, because bacteria hadn't been invented yet, or rather, it hadn't been discovered, though it was definitely making its presence known by way of occasional food poisoning and chronic intestinal distress. Even in noble households, the most hygienic approach to handling food was delegation, getting servants to do the dirty work so you didn't have to. But this only pushed the filth down the chain. There were no gloves, no hairnets, and absolutely no temperature checks. You trusted your staff not to sneeze into the pudding, and if they did, well, that's what spices were for. So how did anyone live through this? Stubborn immune systems and blind optimism. People didn't expect clean. They expected edible, and even that was a moving target. Hygiene was at best a whisper in the wind, and at worst a concept so alien it might as well have arrived via comet. Because in a medieval kitchen, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was down the street, in a locked room, behind a very judgmental priest. And if your stew tasted a little gritty, that was just seasoning with a hint of soot and a dash of rat hair. Bon appétit. Don't look too closely at your spoon. Meat. The centerpiece of any feast, the pride of noble tables, and in medieval times, a bit of a gamble. While modern diners worry about whether their chicken is organic or their steak is grass-fed, medieval folks were more concerned with whether their meat had stopped moving recently, or worse, started again. The meat selection in the Middle Ages was a mix of curiosity, desperation, and a healthy disregard for modern food safety guidelines. It was less a menu and more a roulette wheel with feathers, fur, or scales. Let's start at the top of the social food chain, the nobility. If you were wealthy, congratulations, you had access to a carnivorous carnival that included everything from roasted swan to stuffed peacock. That's right, birds. So majestic they were practically medieval mascots, were unceremoniously feathered, spiced, and served. Sometimes, to really impress your dinner guests, the skin and feathers were stitched back on after cooking, so it looked like the bird had just landed on your plate mid-strut. Nothing says fine dining like a meal that stares back at you. These animals weren't chosen for their taste, mind you. Blondes, for instance, are stringy, tough, and taste vaguely like wet towels. But they were expensive, rare, and required permission from the king to hunt, so naturally, nobles couldn't get enough of them. The flavor didn't matter as long as you could show off your wealth by gnawing on something most peasants would only see in stained glass windows. Think of it as the medieval version of eating gold leaf sushi. And then there were peacocks, bright, flamboyant, and utterly unappetizing. These birds were often roasted and served redressed in their own feathers for maximum wow factor. Whether anyone actually enjoyed the flavor remains unclear, but no one dared complain. It's hard to critique the chef when the bird on your plate costs more than your yearly income, but the nobility didn't stop at birds. Hedgehogs, badgers, porcupines, you name it. Someone tried to roast it. Recipes survive for cooking beaver tails, and not just because they were chewy curiosities. In fact, monks found a convenient loophole by classifying beavers as fish, so they could eat them during Lent. If it swam, slithered or squeaked, it could end up on a plate, often coated in spices so thick that you'd need a palate made of iron to taste anything beyond pepper and cloves. Of course, spices weren't always about taste. They were often used to disguise the fact that your meat was already halfway to haunting you. A little nutmeg here, a pinch of saffron there, and voila, your week-old mutton becomes aged. Think of it as the medieval version of dry aging, minus refrigeration and common sense. Meanwhile, at the other end of the socio-economic spectrum, peasants were busy redefining the phrase "eat what you can catch." Their meat selection depended less on preference and more on speed. If it ran slowly, flew clumsily, or was foolish enough to loiter near a cooking fire, it became dinner. Rats? Technically meat. Frogs? A protein source. That pigeon that crashed into the church window? Blessed by God and ready for roasting. When meat was available, it was usually from old animals no longer fit for labor or reproduction, so the meat was tough, stringy, and about as easy to chew as medieval philosophy. Boiling was the peasant's friend, not because it improved flavor, but because it softened the meat enough to chew without snapping your molars. Preservation was also a problem. Without reliable cold storage, meat went bad quickly. Smoking, salting, and drying helped. But unless you had access to an ice cellar, read Noble Money, your beef could turn before the pot boiled. And even when meat was fresh, it might still contain extra surprises, worms, grubs, or the medieval chef's favorite ingredient, ignorance. You might think hunting provided an answer, but it was illegal for most peasants. The king owned the deer, the forests, and even some rivers. Get caught with a bow and arrow, and you weren't just cooking illicit meat, you were poaching in the literal, legal, and culinary sense. So people resorted to traps, snares, and sheer dumb luck. If it fell in a ditch and broke its leg, dinner was served. As for preparation, let's just say the phrase "don't ask, don't tell" applied heavily. A spit over the fire, a few herbs if available, and a lot of wishful thinking. Frying pans were rare, ovens were built into communal village spaces, and most meat was boiled into submission. By the time it hit the bowl, flavor was a suggestion and texture was optional. Still, for all its shortcomings, meat was coveted. It was a sign of strength, wealth, and fortune, even if that fortune looked like a charred hedgehog or a swan that fought back. Because in the end, if it was dead and didn't bite back much, someone somewhere in medieval Europe was definitely trying to eat it. And that's how the medieval meat menu worked. Part luck, part status, and all deeply questionable. From the high table to the thatched roof hut, every bite was an adventure and often a risk. But when your other option is week-old gruel, even a crunchy squirrel starts looking like filet mignon. If you think your office has too many middle managers, spare a thought for the medieval kitchen staff. Behind every decadent feast for a noble lord, or even a relatively modest one for the local baron, was a team of overworked, underpaid, soot-covered individuals with job titles that sounded either majestic or completely made up. Welcome to the culinary chain of command, medieval style, where workplace hierarchy was both very real and very smoky. Let's begin at the top. The master cook, the chef of the 13th century minus the TV show, the swearing, okay, maybe not, and the access to running water. This person was responsible for managing everything, from meal planning and staff supervision to sourcing ingredients and making sure nobody accidentally roasted the cat. He was a cross between a head chef, a logistics manager, and a crisis negotiator, especially when the wine cellar ran dry or a roast boar fell into the fire. Beneath him were layers of specialists who did not have the luxury of being specialists. The larder keeper had the oh-so-charming job of managing raw meats, fish, and other perishables in a time when fresh was more of an aspiration than a reality. He had to know where everything was, what could still be cooked, and what had passed the threshold into experimental penicillin. Then there was the spit boy, or turnbroach, a job that was quite literally turning meat on a spit all day long. Imagine being 8 years old, sweaty, hungry, and standing next to an open fire for hours, manually rotating a giant boar using a handle. Now imagine doing it with no protective gear and the occasional slap from a spoon if you got distracted. The position was typically filled by young boys or servants of the lowest rank, mostly because adults quickly realized they didn't want to live life as a rotisserie operator. There were scullions, the grunt workers of the medieval kitchen, tasked with cleaning pots the size of bathtubs and scrubbing greasy wooden surfaces with what was hopefully ash and not just dirt. These poor souls lived at the bottom of the kitchen ladder, figuratively and literally, since the kitchen floor often doubled as a dumping ground for bones, gristle and mystery sludge. The job required more strength and skill, and ideally no sense of smell. You also had the sorcerer, the original sauce chef, whose job was to create flavor-enhancing concoctions to disguise the fact that the meat might be slightly off. A master of spice and dubious experimentation, the sorcerer's creations ranged from delicious to deeply unsettling. And if you think your boss micromanages, imagine having to explain why your gravy didn't hide the scent of slightly fermented pigeon. Now let's not forget about the pantler, in charge of the pantry, the butler in charge of the beverages and buttery, not what we think of as a butler today, and the baker, who had his own realm of floury chaos to manage, often separate from the main kitchen due to the explosive nature of wood-fired ovens and the alarming frequency with which they burned the place down. All of these individuals worked in a tightly choreographed, barely controlled culinary circus. In a noble household, a feast wasn't just dinner, it was a display of wealth, power, and social dominance. And nothing said dominance like a swan reassembled with its feathers post-roast, or a pie that looked suspiciously like it might bite you back. Pulling off such an event required precision, planning, and about 60 people with knives, pans, and short tempers. But there was no glamour. Forget breaks. A kitchen hand could work from dawn until long past midnight, preparing meals for a lord who might take one bite and throw the rest to his dogs or worse to the court jester. And there were no HR departments to file a complaint when your co-worker set your sleeve on fire or mistook your thumb for a turnip. And the noise? Imagine cleavers hitting chopping blocks, people shouting over boiling pots, chickens squawking, and a noble woman demanding that her fish not smell like fish. Add a little screaming, some of it casual, some of it fire-related, and you've got the soundtrack to a medieval meal prep session. Promotions were possible, sure, but not likely. You might go from spit boy to assistant spit boy supervisor after only a decade of flawless meat turning, but mostly you stayed where you were, exhausted, singed, and vaguely sticky from something that probably used to be soup. In short, the medieval kitchen hierarchy was a well-oiled, if very smoky machine, fueled by long hours, social rigidity, and enough elbow grease to scrub a moat. It was hot, chaotic, and completely essential to keeping the upper classes feasting and the lower classes hoping not to be reassigned to rat duty, because in the end, working in a medieval kitchen wasn't about passion or artistry, it was about survival. And if you didn't get burned, yelled at, or trampled by a delivery of live geese by the end of the day, you were doing great. Welcome to the smoky, smouldering heart of medieval culinary misery, where cooking was only half the problem, and the other half involved coughing like you had tuberculosis without the romance of a tragic Victorian novel. In the grand drama of medieval kitchens, fire didn't just cook the food, it cooked the lungs, burned the eyes, and perfumed everyone with the delightful aroma of campfire in a closet. Let's start with one of the biggest problems of medieval kitchens, the complete and utter absence of chimneys. Yes, that architectural marvel which elegantly guides smoke out of your house and into the air above did not become widespread until the late Middle Ages. Before that, kitchens were essentially indoor barbecues without exits. If you've ever tried making s'mores indoors with the windows shut, you've only scratched the surface. The hearth, placed proudly in the center of the kitchen, like a miniature volcano, would roar with open flames. Bread ovens, meat roasts, stews, boiling pots, all contributed to the kitchen atmosphere. And by atmosphere we mean dense, acrid, tear-inducing smoke. It clung to the rafters, drifted into your soup, got in your hair, and basically created an immersive 4D experience you could smell, taste, see, and regret. In fact, kitchens weren't just smoky, they were medical hazards. The people who spent their lives laboring in them, cooks, apprentices, spit boys, often developed respiratory issues long before old age. Chronic coughing was common, as were irritated eyes, and what historians politely call chronic pulmonary distress, and less politely could be called smoke-marinated lungs. And since we're on the topic of eyeballs, it's worth noting that the smoke was not selective. It wasn't like modern campfire smoke that politely wafts in your general direction before being carried away by the breeze. Medieval kitchen smoke wanted everyone to cry. It swirled low to the ground, sat in corners, and blew directly into your face every time you tried to taste the stew or rescue a goose from the oven. Think of it as nature's way of saying, stop cooking, save yourself. Now, while the cooks were trying not to asphyxiate, the rest of the household wasn't much better off, because kitchens were often attached directly to the main hall, or worse, inside it in smaller homes. The smoke didn't stay put. It crept into bedrooms, cloaks, prayer books, and undergarments. Everyone walked around smelling like they had just emerged from a charcoal kiln, and that included the nobility. Forget perfumes or bathing. The dominant medieval scent profile was smoked man, scorched lady, or aromatic ashtray. It was a time when your nose adjusted not because things got better, but because it gave up. Guests didn't comment on the smell because, well, what would be the point? That was just the fragrance of existence. Air freshener, one might say. Oh, you mean burnt onion? We have plenty of that. It wasn't until the 12th to 14th centuries that chimneys began to catch on in noble households, and even then, only the very wealthy had access to them. Peasants, as usual, were left to stew in their own indoor weather systems. These early chimneys were often inefficient, leaky, or simply decorative, a symbol of progress. Sure, but more often a slow, frustrating climb out of the Stone Age smog. Another unintended consequence of these smoke-filled kitchens was fire risk. Hot embers were regularly blown back into flammable materials, like wooden walls, straw-covered floors, or your average cook's hair. Fires weren't rare, they were expected. It's no surprise that many medieval cities passed ordinances requiring bakers and cooks to build their ovens outside the main living quarters. The message was clear. We know you're going to burn something down, please just do it far away. You might think that the smoke might help in preserving meat or adding flavor to dishes. In a way, sure, everything tasted faintly of fireplace, but that wasn't always the goal. In fact, the flavors were usually drowned out by the overwhelming bitterness of soot. Unless you liked your dinner to taste like licking the bottom of a coal scuttle, you were probably out of luck. And let's spare a moment for the animals. Dogs, cats, chickens, and even pigs often roamed inside medieval kitchens. They too had no escape from the constant smoke, and thus even your local pig smelled like a barbecue before being turned into one. So next time you burn toast and complain about the smoke detector going off, just be grateful you have one. In medieval times, the smoke didn't just alert you to danger, it was the danger. Your kitchen was not only a place of nourishment, it was also a slow, smoky death trap, complete with seasoning and the occasional pigeon winging its way through the rafters. In short, the medieval kitchen didn't come with a ventilation system. It came with an acceptance that everything you cooked and everything you wore, touched, and breathed would come with a complementary layer of ash. Welcome to flavor country, population, you, and whatever lungs you have left. If you thought cooking in the medieval world was just a quaint affair involving herbs, hearths, and a helpful nun with a ladle, think again. The reality? More extreme sport than culinary art. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, where boiling oil might ambush you like a silent assassin, and cauldrons had the disconcerting habit of erupting like miniature volcanoes. Let's set the scene. You're a kitchen worker in a noble's manor or bustling monastery. The room is a mix of heat, chaos, and questionable smells. You're juggling an iron pot the size of a toddler, balanced precariously on a metal tripod that was clearly designed by someone who hated structural stability. Around you, steam hisses, grease spits, and someone is probably yelling about a goose that's both on fire and undercooked. Now, the centerpiece of medieval kitchen weaponry, cookware, was the cauldron. This wasn't your cute, bubbling Halloween decoration. We're talking about a cast-iron behemoth suspended over a roaring open flame, filled with enough liquid to stew half a village. These things were heavy, unsteady, and often hung from chains that creaked ominously with every stir. Add to that the fact that temperature control in a medieval kitchen was less precise thermostat and more eyeball it and hope. Fires could go from simmer to inferno without warning, and if the contents of the cauldron got too hot too fast, boom, the pressure build-up could literally cause the thing to burst, sending hot stew, chunks of bone, and scalding liquid across the room in a surprise medieval reenactment of a Michael Bay film. But exploding cookware wasn't your only enemy. You also had unstable cooking surfaces, and by unstable we mean constructed by someone who thought safety was a pagan myth. Shelves teetered, spits could collapse. Hot pans were left on uneven bricks or wooden tables that bowed and cracked under the weight. It was a workplace where gravity had a personal vendetta. Let's talk boiling oil, because apparently just having open flames wasn't hazardous enough. Deep frying wasn't a daily thing for peasants, but in noble kitchens it was used to get that crisp finish on pastries or roast fowl. The oil, of course, was heated in large open pans, which would spit like angry cats when stirred too quickly, or if a single drop of water was introduced. Burns from boiling oil were agonizing, and without modern medicine, the best treatment often involved herbal salves and praying very hard. Steam was another stealth killer. With no concept of pressure cookers or safe lids, steam often escaped suddenly and with enough force to peel skin. One distracted moment near the wrong pot could leave a cook with blistered hands, a scalded face, or both. And since medieval kitchens weren't known for their OSHA compliance, or for knowing what OSHA was, accidents were common, and usually met with a shrug and a rag soaked in wine. Then there was the heavy iron cookware itself. These pans weren't just durable, they were back-breaking. A large pan could weigh over 20 pounds before you filled it with food. Lifting, moving, or accidentally dropping one could result in everything from a sprained wrist to a broken foot. Not to mention the occasional oops, the pan fell into the fire and now we're playing who can fish it out without dying. And for the truly unlucky, there were ceiling collapses. You see, medieval kitchens were often built in the oldest, most poorly maintained wing of the building. Between the moisture, the heat, the weight of hanging meats, and the never-ending smoke soaking into wooden beams, the structural integrity of your workplace was about as dependable as a wet parchment. Ceilings fell, rafters cracked, and sometimes entire sections of wall just gave up. It wasn't unheard of for a cook to vanish under a pile of stones, soot, and soup. Of course, all this carnage happened without gloves, aprons, or safety goggles, no protective clothing, just rough-spun tunics, singed eyebrows, and the unwavering hope that today would not be the day you became part of the stew. Even minor injuries could snowball. A burn might fester, a cut could turn septic. There was no sick leave, only try not to bleed on the turnips. And when someone did die in a kitchen accident, it wasn't exactly rare. The response was usually somewhere between unfortunate and who's next on the rota. So yes, cooking in medieval times wasn't just a job. It was a daily test of reflexes, strength, and whether or not you'd angered the fire gods. You weren't a cook. You were a gladiator in an apronless, ash-smeared arena. If the fire didn't get you, the boiling stew might. And if that didn't, well, the ceiling could always collapse. Welcome to the medieval feast, a place where extravagance, ego, and poorly thought-out culinary stunts collided in a glorious spectacle of spectacle itself. If you think modern dinner parties can be a disaster when someone burns the roast or forgets the vegan option, you haven't seen a pastry castle collapse under its own ambition or a pie burst open and release a live bird that promptly immolated itself on a candelabra. Medieval feasts were less culinary showcase and more edible theatre with pyrotechnics and a mild risk of salmonella. At a noble banquet, food wasn't just food, it was performance art. dinner theatre, and a not-so-subtle flex of wealth and power. Lords and ladies didn't just want to eat, they wanted to witness, and so the medieval cook became less of a chef and more of a stage director for chicken drumsticks. Presentation often trumped taste. If it looked impressive, that was half the battle. Whether it tasted like spiced sawdust was nobody's concern, especially when you were competing with Geoffrey next door, who just served eel molded into the shape of a knight jousting a turnip. Some of these stunts were truly audacious. Entire animals were reassembled after cooking to appear whole again, dressed in elaborate costumes or dyed with saffron and gold leaf. Peacocks were especially popular, roasted, redressed in their own dazzling feathers, and served as the medieval equivalent of edible fireworks. Unfortunately, edible fireworks sometimes behaved like real ones. One of the more disturbing trends was entremets, essentially edible side acts meant to entertain between courses. A recurring favorite, animals stuffed into animals into, yes, even more animals. Think turducken, but with less logic and a lot more fur. A boar might be stuffed with a goose, which in turn contained a chicken which held a pigeon, all resting atop a crust of bread, and the chef's rapidly disintegrating sanity. The goal? Astonishment. The result? Frequently undercooked poultry and a long night of gastrointestinal uncertainty. And when they got really ambitious, things went from strange to let's hope there's a fire extinguisher. One of the most infamous culinary catastrophes involved a large pie, seemingly innocent, incredibly ambitious. It was a hollow pastry shell designed to contain a live bird. The plan was that when the pie was opened at the banquet table, the bird would fly out, shocking and delighting guests with the whimsical miracle of life. The reality was more like a nature documentary directed by disaster. The bird, in a state of panic from being trapped in pastry, exploded out of the pie, flapped straight into an open flame and proceeded to torch a curtain. Guests screamed, musicians fled. The chef presumably questioned every decision that led to this moment. And that wasn't the only time the food caught fire before anyone could eat it. Feasts often featured massive centerpieces, sugar sculptures, pastry palaces, towers of jellied meats, but medieval kitchens weren't exactly equipped with engineering degrees. When gravity and hubris joined forces, disaster followed. In one recorded case, an edible castle built from sweet dough, marzipan, and boiled sugar collapsed mid-toast, sending pieces flying into noble laps and denting at least one heirloom goblet. And let's not even talk about the time they tried to include a working miniature windmill on a cake. It spun once and launched the roof into the soup. There was nothing subtle about these meals. The higher the risk, the more points for creativity, even if the outcome was less bon appetit and more fear factor. Despite the chaos, guests played their part. You didn't complain when your venison stew had a hint of feathers or when your pudding started to slide off the table like it had somewhere to be. You clapped, you smiled, and you pretended to enjoy the spectacle because displeasing a host who just served flaming swan eggs was a good way to get banished, or worse, invited to do it all again next week. Some guests even brought their own spices to mask the flavors, or their own taster to make sure they weren't about to be the surprise twist of the evening. Feast disasters weren't just culinary misfires. They were a testament to the sheer audacity of medieval hospitality. The cooks worked miracles with limited knowledge, dangerous tools and unpredictable ingredients, but when it all went sideways, it went sideways loudly. And yet, no matter how chaotic, these feasts remained the centerpieces of medieval social life, proof that even in an age of dirt floors and dysentery, people still knew how to throw a party. Just maybe bring a fire bucket, and your own cutlery, and possibly a live bird of your own, just in case you're asked to contribute. After all, in the medieval feast world, survival wasn't guaranteed, but at least the entertainment was cooked to order. In the grand chaos of medieval kitchens, there existed a unique culinary world where food wasn't just cooked, it was consecrated. Welcome to the monastic kitchen, where silence reigned, soup simmered slowly, and dinner came with a side of divine intervention. Forget shouting head chefs and kitchen nightmares. This was more heavenly meditation meets vegetable chopping, Monasteries in medieval Europe were not just places for prayer and parchment illumination, they were also logistical hubs for feeding anywhere from a dozen to several hundred hungry monks, novices, guests, and the occasional very lost traveler. And it all had to happen with minimal talking, maximum humility, and frequent reminders that gluttony was in fact a sin. The average medieval monk didn't wake up dreaming of roast swan or spice-laden stews. Monastic diets were designed to be plain, sparse, and soul-cleansing. Think lentils, leeks, turnips, and a whole lot of porridge. Meals were dictated by strict rules from the Rule of Saint Benedict or similar spiritual frameworks. That meant designated meal times, designated meal sizes, and in some places, designated chewing paces. Yes, chewing. Slowly, reverently, on feast days which were surprisingly common thanks to the crowded saint calendar. The monks might get an upgrade, maybe some fish, cheese, or fruit if they were lucky. But meat? That was largely forbidden, especially for the cloistered, who weren't supposed to indulge in the pleasures of the flesh, even if that flesh was cooked and served with gravy. The monastic kitchen came with its own divine order. The refectorian oversaw the dining hall, the cellarer managed food supplies, and the kitchener, yes, that was the title, oversaw daily meals. The frater who actually stirred the cauldron might have been a humble monk who also handled prayers mid-simmer. That's right, multitasking in the form of spiritual chanting while gruel bubbled dangerously close to the rim. It wasn't all quiet reverence, though. Feeding hundreds of people on a tight schedule with limited resources required serious coordination, especially during big religious celebrations. Bread had to be baked in industrial batches, vegetables chopped by the basket, and soup pots large enough to bathe in were dragged onto open flames, all in silence, or as close to silence as you can get while wrestling cabbage. Religion and cooking were deeply intertwined. Bread wasn't just a staple. It was blessed, broken, and sometimes believed to contain divine properties. Many abbeys even had a designated monk for blessing food before meals. Not for safety reasons, mind you, but to make sure your turnip stew didn't inadvertently offend heaven. Then there were fasting periods like Lent, when meat, dairy, and joy were off the menu. Monks got creative, using almond milk instead of cow's milk, and turning fish into a protein-packed loophole. Eels, for example, were technically not meat, and therefore found themselves on monastic menus in disturbingly creative forms: eel pie, eel stew, or eel pretending to be sausage. Fish on Fridays wasn't just a tradition, it was a holy obligation with a slimy aftertaste. Of course, sometimes the line between religious devotion and dietary despair was very thin. Monks often believed that self-denial led to spiritual clarity. Translation: if dinner tasted like boiled sadness, you were probably doing it right. Let's not forget what might be the monk's greatest culinary contribution to the world: beer. Brewing was an art and a holy service, especially in Benedictine and Trappist monasteries. These weren't rowdy pints at the local tavern. Monastic beer was brewed with precision, purity, and a fair bit of pride. It was safer than the water and often more nutritious than the food. Each sip of monk-brewed ale was technically medicinal. It hydrated, fortified, and conveniently allowed the monks to get a little tipsy without violating too many commandments. Call it divine loophole drinking. Despite the prayers, silence, and sacred purpose, monastic kitchens were still kitchens. Fires burned, onions wept, pots boiled over, and occasionally Brother Thomas tripped over a bucket. While the average medieval kitchen outside might have been a soot-smeared chaos zone, the monastic version tried very hard to be orderly, and sometimes it even succeeded, if only because eternal damnation was a surprisingly strong motivator to keep your station clean. Monks spent hours over simmering pots, heads bowed in quiet contemplation, stirring with one hand and clutching rosary beads with the other. But spiritual cooking didn't make the food any tastier, it just made it holier, and sometimes a little moldy. Because even divine bread still had to face medieval storage conditions. In the end, the monastic kitchen was less about flavor and more about faith. Meals were a means to nourish the body just enough to keep it going, so the soul could do the real work. There were no Michelin stars, no fire-roasted spectacles, and definitely no dessert menus, just humble fare served in silence, under the watchful gaze of saints carved into the stone walls. And if you ever find yourself chewing on something that tastes like penance, just remember, God may have provided the bread, but the mold came free of charge. Before Francisco Pizarro went around toppling empires and causing civilizational whiplash, he was quite frankly a nobody, not a charming, misunderstood kind of nobody. No, a literal nobody, born in the dusty town of Trujillo, Spain, around 1474, to a soldier father and a mother who wasn't his father's wife. That made him illegitimate, which in 15th century Spain was basically the social equivalent of being born with "do not promote" tattooed on your forehead. He was illiterate, uneducated, and left to the care of relatives who saw childcare as mostly a hands-off hobby. Historians believe young Francisco didn't learn to read or write, but he did learn how to survive by herding pigs. That was his first job. Pigs, not particularly glamorous unless you were the pig. And even then, not great. Pizarro didn't come from nobility. He came from nowhere and stayed ambitious about it. Now, to be fair, Spain at the time was packed with minor nobles, overpopulated towns, and an alarming number of guys named Francisco who thought they were destined for greatness. But our Francisco stood out, not because of charm or education, but because he had this uncanny ability to keep not dying. And in the age of poor hygiene, no antibiotics and a national pastime of sword fights, that was a valuable skill. But Trujillo wasn't a place where you rose through the ranks. It was the kind of town where you rose through the mud if it rained too hard. So like many restless young men with more ambition than options, Francisco turned his eyes westward. Lucky for him, a whole new world had just been announced, courtesy of Columbus and the Spanish crown's boundless appetite for gold, land, and Catholicism. If life gave you pigs, Francisco figured he could trade up to empires. By the early 1500s, Pizarro had made his way across the Atlantic, not as a noble explorer but as muscle for hire, a soldier of fortune, emphasis on fortune. He wasn't leading expeditions, he was more of a guy number 4 with a sword, but that didn't matter. He was there, and that counted for something. His big early break came in 1513, when he joined Vasco Núñez de Balboa, a man best known for discovering the Pacific Ocean and probably bragging about it forever, on a brutal jungle trek across the Isthmus of Panama. Balboa and his crew hacked their way through the dense mosquito-infested terrain, and when they finally reached the Pacific, they stared out at the vast ocean and did what any ambitious Europeans would do, claimed it for Spain and started making plans to discover whatever was on the other side. Pizarro was there for all of it, sweating, slicing through vines, and probably wondering if this was better than pig herding. It was, slightly. No formal education, no noble title, but he did know how to stab things and sail west. This journey also introduced Pizarro to a very important concept. There were empires out there, massive, wealthy ones that had never heard of Spain, let alone small-town pig boys with swords. Balboa heard rumors of a golden kingdom to the south, ruled by people who wore shiny things and, crucially, hadn't yet been conquered. Pizarro tucked that detail into his mental treasure chest, right next to "Don't die from jungle rot." By the 1520s, Pizarro was climbing the colonial ladder. He helped found the city of Panama and even got involved in some of the less glamorous administrative work, because even empire building needs paperwork. But his ambition was sharpening. He wasn't interested in managing a settlement. He wanted a kingdom, specifically the one Balboa had heard whispers about, something called Biru, which would soon become Peru, and even sooner become his problem. What makes Pizarro fascinating and slightly terrifying is how little he started with. He didn't have a family name worth anything. He didn't have maps, books, or formal strategy. What he had was grit, luck, and a growing obsession with gold. Combine that with Spain's tendency to hand out conquest licenses like candy at a carnival, and you've got a recipe for one of the most absurdly successful and catastrophic invasions in history. But before he could rewrite South America's fate, he had to do something even harder. convince other people to join him in this reckless adventure. Which, spoiler alert, is exactly what he does next. If there's one thing that consistently motivated 16th century Spaniards to risk death by jungle, drowning, or decorative spear, it was gold, not food, not fame, not even land, just shiny, malleable metal. And in the early 1520s, a tantalizing whisper began to echo through the Caribbean colonies. Somewhere south of Panama, there was a kingdom paved with the stuff. No one could say exactly where this golden kingdom was, or how big it might be, or if it actually existed. But for people like Francisco Pizarro, who had already played background character in other men's expeditions, that didn't matter. The rumor was enough. After all, Spain had just looted the Aztec Empire into oblivion, and Cortés had gone from some guy to governor of Mexico in record time. Pizarro didn't need a map. He needed a boat, a few men, and the audacity to think he could pull off the same trick further south. The Spanish heard there was gold, so naturally they packed their swords and a sense of entitlement. In 1524, Pizarro and a fellow conquistador, Diego de Almagro, launched their first expedition along the Pacific coast of South America. The partnership was solid in theory. Pizarro was the veteran soldier with a taste for risk. Almagro was the slightly more diplomatic one with one working eye and a lot of ambition. Together they were the perfect pair to get horribly lost. The first expedition was, to put it gently, a hot mess. The small force battled storms, starvation, and angry locals who did not roll out the welcome mat. The coastline was harsh and unfamiliar, and instead of gold, they found mud, mosquitoes, and mangrove hellscapes. Almagro even lost an eye to an arrow, an occupational hazard for anyone asking, "Do you speak Spanish?" in hostile territory. But here's the strange part. They still came back excited. Why? Because even in failure, they saw hints. Incan pottery, stories from captured natives, and glimpses of large organized towns just out of reach. In Pizarro's mind, this wasn't failure, it was foreplay. By 1526 they tried again. This time they ventured farther, reaching the northern edges of what was, unbeknownst to them, the Inca Empire's frontier. Here, things got weird. The Spaniards began hearing detailed accounts of a powerful empire ruled by a single man, where people wore gold jewelry, ate from golden plates, and apparently tossed gold around like it was breadcrumbs. They didn't have a name for it yet, so they stuck with the vague term Biru, which was a local distortion of a coastal chief's name. Spain would eventually twist it into Peru, because nothing says new country like aggressively mispronouncing the old one. It was like a medieval treasure hunt, except everyone died horribly if you guessed wrong. And so began the full descent into gold fever. This was a condition not found in modern medicine, but well documented among conquistadors. Symptoms included extreme optimism, poor decision-making, and frequent use of phrases like "just one more voyage." Despite the dangers, disease, and a consistent lack of actual treasure, Pizarro believed, after all, what's more Spanish than assuming your wildest dreams are someone else's reality? It's worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer lunacy of it all. Pizarro had no official army, no reliable map, no royal backing, and no idea what the Inca Empire really was. He just kept sailing further south because somebody mentioned gold in passing. That's it. That's the entire business model. Conquest based on rumors. Exploration was basically colonial gambling. Imagine hearing a vague Yelp review about a gold buffet 2 countries away and deciding to hike there barefoot through hostile wilderness with 80 men and a sword. That's essentially what Pizarro did. Back in Panama, colonial officials weren't impressed. They saw Pizarro's expeditions as expensive, dangerous, and mostly pointless. After all, the man kept coming back with wounded men and wide eyes instead of solid returns. But Pizarro didn't care. He was convinced that he was on the brink of discovering another Mexico, and this time he'd be Cortés. When local support dried up, Pizarro took a dramatic turn. During the second expedition, facing starvation and growing mutiny, he allegedly drew a line in the sand with his sword. On one side, the path back to Panama and safety. On the other, the path forward to danger, disease, and theoretical gold. Only 13 men crossed that line with him. 13. That's not even enough to start a decent bar fight. But for Pizarro, it was enough to prove that the dream of empire, however illogical, was alive and itchy with mosquito bites. These expeditions didn't make him rich yet, but they gave him something more important: proof. Proof that there really was something out there, something organized, something golden. And once he had that sliver of truth, he had all the ammunition he needed for what came next: a trip back to Spain, where he would convince the crown that he wasn't just another pig farmer turned swordsman. He was the man who was going to bring home an empire. By the late 1520s, Francisco Pizarro had returned to Panama with tales of a glittering empire just waiting to be conquered. He had no treasure, few men, and a growing reputation for dragging people into miserable expeditions, but that didn't stop him from dreaming big. Unfortunately, Panama's colonial administrators weren't interested in dreams. They wanted results, receipts, and preferably something that hadn't been scraped off a sickly sailor's boot. So Pizarro did what any ambitious man in a dead-end colony would do. He booked a boat to Spain. If no one in Panama would fund another suicidal trek down the coast of South America, maybe someone in Madrid would. Better yet, maybe the king himself. Because if you're going to ask for royal permission to conquer a continent, you might as well go straight to the top. It was 1528 when Pizarro arrived back in the Old World, still poor, still unpolished, and still unable to write his own name without squinting. But what he did have was a story. A good one, a shiny one, the kind of story that makes monarchs lean forward in their thrones and whisper, "How many zeros are we talking here?" He brought with him a few captured indigenous people, some gold trinkets, and a lot of charisma for a guy with a pig-herding past. It didn't take long before he was ushered into royal court, where he pitched the greatest sales job of his life, an untouched empire full of treasure, begging to be claimed with God's blessing, and of course a small finder's fee for the crown. Pizarro came back with a crown-approved license to plunder, medieval capitalism at its finest. King Charles V, a man whose resume included Holy Roman Emperor and guy who inherits all the maps, listened carefully. Spain had just bled Mexico dry thanks to Cortés, and the idea of another empire down south tickled his treasury. So after a bit of paperwork, read lengthy dramatic discussions involving clerks in feathered hats, the crown gave its blessing in a formal decree known as the Capitulation of Toledo, signed in July 1529. And this wasn't just some royal pat on the back. This was an official document that said, in essence, "Dear Francisco, go forth and pillage, just save us a cut." Imagine asking the king for permission to rob an empire, and he says, "Sure, just bring me 20%. The agreement was extremely generous, suspiciously so. Pizarro was granted the right to conquer and govern the newly discovered lands south of Panama. He'd be titled Governor and Captain General of New Castile, with a slice of territory stretching hundreds of miles. He could appoint officials, collect taxes, and most importantly, keep the lion's share of the loot. But there was one small detail that didn't go unnoticed by anyone who had ever hoarded resentment. His partners were left out. His longtime co-leader, Diego de Almagro, and the expedition's priest, Hernando de Luque, were both conveniently sidelined. Almagro was not present in Spain when the deal was struck. He had stayed behind in Panama, assuming reasonably that Pizarro wouldn't forget him. He was wrong, very wrong. Almagro missed the meeting. He'd never stop being salty about it. Pizarro didn't exactly erase Almagro from the record, but he certainly blurred him at the edges. In the official agreement, Almagro's role was downgraded, and Pizarro was elevated to near royal authority. Think of it like one guy getting promoted to CEO while the other gets demoted to unpaid intern, and then still being expected to chip in on the coffee run. This quiet betrayal planted a seed. Almagro wasn't just frustrated, he was furious, and his rage would simmer for years, growing like a moldy loaf in a humid Spanish kitchen. But for now he swallowed his pride, because he too wanted a cut of the gold, even if it came with a side of humiliation. Meanwhile, Pizarro stayed in Spain a little longer to enjoy his sudden celebrity glow-up. He even visited his hometown of Trujillo. The pig-herding boy returned as a royal governor-in-waiting, with new clothes, new titles, and the crown's signature on his conquest pass. Locals probably didn't recognize him, or if they did, they were pretending to. After all, this was now Don Francisco Pizarro, empire builder, not that guy who once lost a pig in someone's cabbage patch. He also brought his 4 half-brothers into the fold: Hernando, Juan, Gonzalo, and Francisco Martín de Alcántara, because what's a conquest without a little nepotism? These brothers would go on to form the Pizarro family conquest squad too, and cause a shocking amount of drama and bloodshed later on. But for now, the family reunion was one of optimism and coordinated armor fittings. With the king's blessing and a royal decree in hand, Pizarro packed up his ambitions, gathered his entourage, and set sail back to the New World in 1530. This time, he wasn't just another conquistador, he was the guy in charge. And the Inca Empire, still blissfully unaware, had roughly 2 years left before a small army of hungry Spaniards and their contractually obligated greed arrived on their doorstep. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro stepped onto the coast of Peru with what could generously be described as an army. A very small, heavily sunburned and probably dysentery-prone army. In total, 168 men, 27 horses, a few primitive cannons, and the kind of confidence that only comes from not fully understanding the situation you're walking into. Let's be clear, if this were a video game, Pizarro's difficulty setting would be stuck on nightmare mode. He wasn't marching into some loose collection of villages. He was entering the heart of the Inca Empire, the most sophisticated civilization in South America. An empire of millions, with an army of tens of thousands, a road network that stretched for thousands of miles, terraced agriculture on mounting cliffs, and a complex system of administration and labor. The Spanish had matching helmets and a strong sense of entitlement. The Incas had armies, architecture and organization. The Spanish had horses, steel and blind optimism. Now you might be asking, why didn't the Inca Empire just squash Pizarro and his merry band of conquistadors like the annoying metallic insects they were? The answer: terrible timing. When Pizarro landed, the empire was in the middle of a brutal civil war between 2 brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. These weren't squabbles over who got the bigger bedroom in the palace. This was a full-scale conflict over the throne itself, complete with armies, executions and more backstabbing than a Shakespeare play written by someone with trust issues. The previous Sapper Inca, Huayna Capac, had died of smallpox, courtesy of European germs that arrived before the Europeans themselves. Thanks to this microbial sneak attack, there was no clear succession plan, and his 2 sons turned the empire into a fratricidal bloodbath. By the time Pizarro arrived, Atahualpa had just won. His brother Huáscar was defeated, humiliated, and imprisoned. The empire was battered, the army was divided, and nobody had had a relaxing day in years. The Inca Empire was having a bad year. Pizarro was about to make it worse. Pizarro, for his part, was no military genius, but he had instincts, particularly the kind that sniffed out weakness like a vulture in plate armor. He knew he couldn't win a direct battle, so he leaned into the classic conquistador strategy: confuse, manipulate, and strike when no one's looking. It also helped that the Spanish had a handful of things that blew indigenous minds and eardrums. Horses, for instance, were entirely alien to the Andes. The Inca had never seen them before. To them, a man riding a horse looked like some monstrous human-beast hybrid, especially when that man was also swinging a steel sword and yelling in Castilian Spanish. And then there were the guns. They were slow, inaccurate, and frequently useless, but when they did go off, they sounded like thunder and spat fire. Imagine living in a world where the loudest thing you've heard is a clap of thunder, and suddenly there's a man in metal armor pointing a stick that explodes. You'd be concerned. You'd also reconsider your life choices. It was a 180 versus millions. But the Spanish brought germs, and those don't need armor. The Incas also didn't understand European warfare or motivations. They didn't know that these foreigners were operating under a worldview that mixed religious zeal, royal ambition, and personal greed into one combustible conquest cocktail. They assumed the Spanish were just another tribal group, weirdly dressed and aggressively rude, but manageable. What they didn't realize was that Pizarro and company weren't here to trade. They were here to dismantle the empire one handshake at a time. Still, the Spanish were not operating from a position of strength. Every decision was a gamble. They had no supply lines, no reinforcements, and no exit strategy. One bad move, and they'd be nothing more than armor-wrapped skeletons in the Andean sun. But somehow the risk only seemed to embolden them. These were men with no plans beyond get rich or get buried. And perhaps most tragically for the Incas, they had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox had already cleared a bloody path through the empire, killing thousands and destabilizing everything from food production to religious authority. And while Pizarro didn't understand germs, he definitely noticed that everywhere the Spanish went, the locals got sick and died in horrific numbers. Divine favor? Maybe. Biological warfare? Accidentally, yes. With the Inca Empire reeling from war, grief, and a sudden infestation of white guys in helmets, Pizarro made his move. He sent word to Atahualpa, requesting a meeting, not a fight, not a declaration of war, a friendly audience, which of course is the historical equivalent of a tiger inviting a deer over for dinner and promising to serve salad. But that part's coming soon. For now, all you need to know is this. 168 men stood at the doorstep of an empire, with nothing but a few horses, primitive firearms, and irrational confidence. And somehow, they believed it would be enough. They weren't wrong. If there's ever been a worse way to say nice to meet you, history has yet to find it. The ambush at Cajamarca in November 1532 wasn't just a pivotal moment in the conquest of the Inca Empire. It was a masterclass in deceit, miscommunication, and utter chaos. Francisco Pizarro, fresh off the ship with a few dozen armed friends and a wildly aggressive interpretation of diplomacy, had no interest in making allies. He was there to win, and if that meant flipping the rules of polite society into a bonfire, so be it. Let's set the scene. The town of Cajamarca, nestled high in the Andes, was a cold, remote mountain settlement that would become the stage for one of the most improbable victories in history. Atahualpa, fresh from defeating his brother Huascar in a brutal civil war, was now the Inca emperor, technically unchallenged but definitely exhausted. He had brought with him an entourage of roughly 6,000 attendants, unarmed and finely dressed. Think less battle-ready battalion, and more high-level corporate retreat. Atahualpa assumed, with some justification, that the strange, smelly men with beards were an amusing curiosity. His spies had reported that Pizarro had less than 200 men. No empire in its right mind would call that an invasion force. Atahualpa agreed to meet them, probably expecting a ceremonial exchange of gifts, a few pleasantries, and maybe a performance of exotic Spanish antics for his amusement. He was not expecting muskets, steel, or a friar with a Bible and boundary issues. And yet that's exactly what he got. When Atahualpa entered the plaza, flanked by his thousands of attendants, he was met by absolute silence. Not a soul from Pizarro's side was visible. That's because they were hiding behind walls and in buildings, clutching their weapons like giddy lunatics waiting to yell surprise. Except instead of cake, there were cannons. Out walks Friar Vicente de Valverde, holding a cross in one hand and a Bible in the other. He attempted to convert the Inca emperor on the spot, an ambitious task under any circumstance, but especially when the two had no common language. The friar's Quechua was non-existent, and Atahualpa's Spanish was just as bad. So the moment devolved quickly into an awkward pantomime of gestures, scriptures, and vague shouting. When Atahualpa took the Bible, examined it like someone reading IKEA instructions for the first time, and then tossed it aside as it made no sound or sense, the friar took it personally. He turned on his heel and screamed, "Attack!" And so the madness began. Spanish soldiers exploded from their hiding places, guns blazing and swords swinging. Horses, an animal the Incas had never seen before, charged through the plaza. Cannons fired, muskets boomed, and steel clashed against flesh. Atahualpa's guards, ceremonial and unarmed, were trapped in a stone-walled square with no exits and no weapons. Panic took hold. Thousands were slaughtered in a matter of hours. It was a massacre more than a battle, with psychological shock doing nearly as much damage as Spanish steel. In the midst of this chaos, Pizarro did something that in hindsight seems almost comically ambitious. He ordered Atahualpa to be taken alive, and somehow his men did it. They plucked the emperor from the wreckage of his entourage like a prize from a claw machine. Pizarro reportedly protected Atahualpa himself, slashing at his own men to keep the emperor from being accidentally killed in the frenzy. After all, dead emperors can't pay ransoms, and that's where the genius and moral bankruptcy of Pizarro really shines. He didn't just want to win a battle, he wanted leverage. Capturing the emperor gave him exactly that. From that moment on, every move he made would be shadowed by the presence of a god-king, locked in a room, surrounded by people who didn't understand his world, his culture, or even his language. But they understood gold, and Atahualpa, still trying to play the game, would soon offer a ransom the size of a cathedral. It's easy in hindsight to see the trap, but in the moment the Inca world had no precedent for such a dishonorable approach to diplomacy. Wars had rules, honor mattered, and divine rulers didn't get kidnapped during brunch. The Spanish, however, operated under a different playbook, one in which God, glory, and gold justified just about anything. And so, with a single catastrophic meeting, the fate of an empire was sealed. Atahualpa had walked into Cajamarca expecting to confirm his dominance over a strange new visitor. Instead, he was held hostage by men who wielded thunder, rode beasts, and asked strange questions about a god nailed to a cross. It wasn't just a clash of civilizations, it was a sucker punch. So to recap, Atahualpa showed up to the meeting like it was brunch. Pizarro showed up like it was Mortal Kombat. Nothing says hello like surprise cannons and holy men with translation issues. The Inca emperor had 6,000 guards. None of them were prepared for Spanish nonsense. Atahualpa was many things: a skilled warrior, a brilliant strategist, and unfortunately for him, a man who completely overestimated the Spanish definition of deal. After being ambushed and kidnapped in Cajamarca by a grand total of 180 conquistadors, because who needs an army when you've got surprise and steel? The Inca emperor found himself in the awkward position of trying to negotiate with men who thought diplomacy was just a brief pause before looting. But Atahualpa wasn't about to go down quietly. No, the man had style. He told Pizarro that he would fill a room, literally fill it with gold, and not just any room. We're talking 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 8 feet high. He offered to do this not once, not twice, but once with gold and twice more with silver. That's not just ransom. That's I'm trying to blow your European mind levels of generosity. Why gold? Because for the Spanish, it was basically divine. God was great, but gold was shinier. For the Inca, however, gold wasn't currency. It was sacred. It represented the sun god Inti, and was used in temples, not banks. But Atahualpa, despite being a living deity himself, clearly grasped how utterly enchanted the Spanish were with metal they couldn't eat, wear, or use for farming. If this was the price of his freedom, so be it. So he ordered the empire's artisans and loyalists to begin hauling treasures from all corners of the Inca world. Statues were melted, temple walls were stripped, heirlooms were destroyed. It was like taking apart your entire civilization to pay for one Uber ride home. The gold began to arrive in waves: golden goblets, ceremonial masks, and intricately worked jewelry that had taken lifetimes to craft. The conquistadors, unbothered by artistic value, took it all and melted it down. It's estimated that around 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver were collected. In today's value, that's enough to make even modern hedge fund managers drool. But while Atahualpa was busy paying his ransom, the Spanish were busy planning his funeral. They never had any intention of letting him go. Letting Atahualpa live meant he might rally an army. reclaim his empire, and most dangerously of all, keep his gold. So instead of fulfilling their end of the bargain, they put him on trial. Now, calling it a trial is generous. It was more like a medieval improv skit. The charges included polygamy, which was a bit rich coming from men who often had mistresses on multiple continents, idolatry, from people who carried crucifixes like swords, and most ludicrously inciting rebellion while imprisoned. That's right, Atahualpa was blamed for rebellion while being held under 24-hour armed guard. Next, they probably would have accused him of raining too much on Tuesdays. Despite the kangaroo court vibe, Atahualpa was found guilty. His sentence, death. Originally, he was to be burned at the stake, horrifying not only for its pain, but because it would prevent him from having a proper Inca burial and spiritual afterlife. But in a twist of conditional mercy, he was offered a less horrific option. If he converted to Christianity, he'd be granted a more civilized execution, strangulation by garrote. Not a great deal, but arguably better than barbecuing. So Atahualpa was baptized, renamed Francisco because irony, and then executed in 1533. His death was a seismic blow to the Inca Empire. It wasn't just the loss of a ruler, it was the loss of a god-king, a symbol of divine order. Without Atahualpa, the empire's fragile unity crumbled, factions erupted, rivals emerged. It was like slicing the head off a hydra, except instead of more heads growing back, everything just sort of fell apart. The Spanish, meanwhile, didn't even pause to feel bad. They divvied up the treasure, celebrated a job well plundered, and began their next phase of conquest, like a particularly ruthless traveling sales team. Pizarro got the biggest cut, of course, roughly 4,000 ounces of gold and 8,000 ounces of silver. His men each walked away with enough loot to buy castles, titles, and new identities. The lesson? Kidnap the right emperor, and you'll never work a day in your life. But the cost wasn't just counted in coins. The ransom changed everything. It destroyed the Incas' economy, tore down sacred temples, and sent shockwaves through the Andes that echoed long after the gold had vanished into Spanish vaults. It also set a terrible precedent, one where betrayal became standard operating procedure, and honor was measured in ounces. So yes, Atahualpa made history. He offered what is still considered the largest ransom ever recorded. And what did he get for it? A rope around his neck, a betrayal for the ages, and a footnote in the balance sheet of empire. So the Inca Empire was technically conquered the moment Atahualpa was executed, but as with most things in history, the fine print told a different story. Sure, the Spanish had killed the emperor and pocketed enough gold to make their accountants cry with joy, but they hadn't exactly secured the empire. The real conquest? That was just getting started. And it would come with less fanfare, more backstabbing, and the kind of management style that would make modern HR departments resign on the spot. After Atahualpa's death in 1533, the Spanish crowned his younger brother Hualpa as a convenient puppet. The Incas, being understandably unimpressed by this now with 100% more Spanish supervision arrangement, began to resist. And who could blame them? Their emperor was dead, their gods were under siege, and their temples were being melted down to fund horse armor and fancy ruffles. But the resistance wasn't a neat, unified rebellion. It was scattered and desperate. Some Inca nobles cooperated, hoping to preserve their status. Others fled to the mountains, vowing revenge. And in the middle of all this chaos stood Pizarro, not just a conqueror now, but the newly appointed governor of Peru, as declared by the Spanish crown. Because apparently, if you overthrow a civilization, you get promoted. Pizarro ran Peru like a gold-obsessed startup CEO with a sword, is not an exaggeration. His priorities were simple: secure gold, keep the Spanish crown happy, and don't get stabbed in the back, literally. Unfortunately for him, the last one was about to become an issue. Enter Diego de Almagro. Remember him? The guy Pizarro ditched back in Spain during the whole getting royal approval chapter. Yeah, he hadn't forgotten either. Almagro had been a co-leader, a financier, and a fellow adventurer. and now he was watching Pizarro rake in titles, wealth and land while he got crumbs and altitude sickness. At first, the two managed a fragile alliance. Almagro headed south to explore Chile, chasing rumors of another rich kingdom. Spoiler: Chile was long on mountains and short on gold, so he returned to Peru broke, frostbitten, and in a mood. Meanwhile, Pizarro was sitting in the governor's palace like a man who thought his problems were over. They weren't. The Spanish settlers, now growing in number and insatiable greed, split into factions, Team Pizarro versus Team Almagro. And because these were conquistadors, diplomacy wasn't exactly in their toolkit. What followed was essentially a civil war among invaders. Imagine robbing a bank and then getting into a brawl in the parking lot over who gets the cup holders. Conquering an empire is easier than sharing the credit. That could have been carved into the stone walls of Cusco, now converted into a colonial stronghold. Almagro's forces briefly captured Cusco in 1537, even imprisoning Pizarro's brothers. Negotiations, betrayals, and eventual battle followed, culminating in Almagro's defeat and execution in 1538. Yes, the man who once marched across deserts and mountains with Pizarro was now a headless cautionary tale about mixing friendship with plunder. Meanwhile, the native populations continued to suffer under the weight of disease, slavery, and war. The Inca resistance didn't vanish, it retreated. In 1536, Manco Inca Yupanqui led a major revolt, briefly surrounding Cusco and nearly driving the Spanish out. His campaign failed, but it showed that the heart of the Inca people hadn't been fully conquered, only scattered and bloodied. By the end of the decade, Peru was a fractured mess. The Inca Empire was gone, yes, but in its place was a ticking time bomb of colonial mismanagement. Pizarro ruled from Lima, a city he founded in 1535, which became the new colonial capital. But it wasn't built on stability. It was built on exploitation, arrogance, and the bones of an empire that not long ago stretched across the Andes. And here's the kicker: for all Pizarro's ruthless success, he had created a system that would eventually turn on itself. The Spanish had defeated the Incas, but they hadn't learned a thing about unity. Infighting among conquistadors would persist for decades, and colonial Peru would be a playground of treachery, greed, and endless bloodletting. Because once the empire was gone, the Spanish immediately asked, "Now who do we fight?" Oh, each other. The flames that consumed the Inca Empire didn't die out. They simply changed direction. After years of sword-swinging, empire toppling, and gold hoarding, Francisco Pizarro's life came to an abrupt and bloody end, not on a battlefield, but in the comfort of his own palace. It's the kind of poetic justice history seems to specialize in. The man who conquered an empire through betrayal and violence was ultimately betrayed and violently disposed of by people he once called allies. Turns out, karma had a very sharp point. Let's rewind to 1541. Pizarro was, by then, the governor of Peru, living the colonial dream. Vast wealth, supreme power, and absolutely no job security. While he had outmaneuvered, outlasted, and outright eliminated most rivals, one name refused to stay buried: Diego de Almagro. Well, not Almagro himself. He was already dead, courtesy of Pizarro's orders after their feud over who got to own more of the stolen empire reached its predictable end. But Almagro's son and loyal followers were still around, and as it turns out, they had excellent memories and very sharp daggers. In Lima, Pizarro was living in the palace, a glittering stronghold of European dominance, surrounded by resentment and whispers of revenge. While the native population had been subdued, read, conquered, exploited, and disrespected into submission, the real danger was much closer to home. The remnants of Almagro's faction, known as the Almagristas, weren't content with being left out of the colonial pie. And by pie, we mean gold-covered, blood-soaked control of an entire civilization. The plot was as straightforward as it was effective. On June 26, 1541, a group of around 20 Almagristas stormed Pizarro's palace. He was having lunch, the usual afternoon for a conquistador turned governor. Wine, bread, and probably an overly large gold goblet. When he heard the commotion, Pizarro did what any 60-something seasoned veteran would do. He grabbed a sword and started fighting back. Yes, even as retirement age loomed, Pizarro managed to kill 2 attackers before the others overwhelmed him. It was a gruesome end, stabbed multiple times, bleeding out in his own home, dying not in battle but in betrayal. As the story goes, he made the sign of the cross with his own blood before collapsing, dramatic to the very last breath. Pizarro's assassination didn't exactly restore peace or justice. If anything, it just added another bloody footnote to the endless saga of colonial backstabbing. The Spanish crown, thousands of miles away, barely flinched. It simply appointed another governor. In the eyes of the empire, conquistadors were disposable, just slightly shinier cannon fodder. But his legacy? That's where things get complicated. On one hand, Pizarro founded Lima, one of South America's major cities, and played a pivotal role in reshaping the continent's history. On the other hand, he's also responsible for the destruction of the Inca Empire, the execution of its emperor, and a long list of cultural erasures that modern historians are still untangling. To his supporters, mostly fellow Spaniards and later colonial historians, he was a heroic adventurer, brave, cunning, and divinely favored. To everyone else, he was basically the human embodiment of imperialism, greedy, ruthless, and tragically short-sighted. And let's not forget the delicious irony. The man who manipulated an empire with diplomacy by deception couldn't see the daggers being sharpened by his own colleagues. The conquistador who reduced entire cities to rubble by promising peace, then delivering powder and steel, was brought down by the very tactics he helped perfect. In the end, Francisco Pizarro's death didn't come with a grand battle or royal trial. It came from a handful of angry co-workers with unfinished business. There were no trumpets, no banners, and definitely no statues being raised that day. Just a pool of blood, a crumbling palace wall, and a history that would be written by those who survived him, often with very selective pens. The conquest of the Inca Empire was over, but the echoes of its fall, the greed, the glory, the knives in the back would echo through centuries. As for Pizarro, he got a city named after him, a few controversial monuments, and a permanent spot in the annals of died because you forgot that your friends hate you. It's not quite the legacy he envisioned, but it's undeniably fitting. Before Captain James Cook was charting coastlines, fending off tropical diseases, and learning the hard way that you should never outstay your welcome in Hawaii, he was just a Yorkshire lad in breeches, born in 1728 in the village of Marton, a place so quiet even the sheep probably complained about the boredom. Cook entered the world with humble expectations. His father was a Scottish agricultural labourer, meaning the family wasn't exactly rolling in dough, more like rolling in mud, and only when it rained. Cook's early years were defined by chores, farm life, and walking the kind of distances modern teenagers would faint at. He herded animals, helped his dad, and did the kind of back-breaking work that builds either character or a lifelong resentment of hay. Yet somewhere in this dusty world of ploughs and pig pens, a spark formed, perhaps a yearning for something bigger, or maybe just a desire to not smell manure every morning. But despite the humble setting, James wasn't without options. He was bright, focused, and known for a steely seriousness that probably made other kids deeply uncomfortable. At age 16, he was apprenticed to a grocer and haberdasher in the fishing village of Staithers. This, on paper, should have been a solid start. Stable trade, room for advancement, and all the pickled herring you could sniff. Unfortunately for Cook, that particular scent did not inspire dreams of entrepreneurial glory. Within a year, he decided that selling cod liver oil and lace was not the path to greatness, or even tolerable personal hygiene. Instead, he signed up with the Merchant Navy, because when you hate fish smell on land, what better option than to live on a floating fish market? He joined a coal ship out of Whitby, a town whose motto might as well have been, "We transport dirty rocks and like it." While not glamorous, these voyages gave Cook something far more valuable than clean sheets: experience. He learned the practical skills of seamanship, navigation, and how to not die in a storm off the British coast. He spent hours mastering dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and the art of not annoying the ship's cook, a man who could and would ruin your week with a single spoiled stew. Cook's rise through the merchant navy was steady. He earned his mate's certificate in 1752, and could have had a fine career moving coal up and down the coast of Britain. Exciting stuff if your life goal was slowly becoming a human chimney. But Cook wasn't done climbing or sailing. In 1755, at age 27, he did something few ambitious young men would dare. He gave up a likely promotion in the merchant navy to volunteer for the Royal Navy as a common seaman. Translation: he chose less money, more risk, and stricter uniforms, all in the name of empire, exploration, and possibly boredom-induced madness. This was the beginning of his transformation from coal ship mate to cartographic superstar. The Royal Navy, always on the hunt for men who could sail without vomiting and do math without crying, quickly noticed Cook's abilities. He wasn't flashy, but he was frighteningly competent. During the 7 Years' War, he served aboard the HMS Pembroke and impressed everyone by mapping the St. Lawrence River during the Siege of Quebec. Not bad for a guy who grew up drawing in dirt with sticks. It turns out if you're good with a sextant and don't get seasick while under fire, the British military will fast-track you. Cook became a master of surveying, known for his precise, obsessively neat charts. And in a world before GPS, Google Maps, or even halfway reliable compasses, that made him something of a superhero. If superheroes wore tricorn hats and spoke fluent trigonometry, by 1768 Cook had earned not just a fancy officer's uniform, but also the backing of the Royal Society, a group of posh science men who wanted someone brave, red disposable to lead a voyage to observe the transit of Venus in Tahiti, and secretly look for a big mysterious continent in the southern hemisphere. Cook said yes. Partly out of ambition, partly out of curiosity, and partly because Yorkshire winters make even the Pacific look cozy. So there he was. The boy who once mucked out barns was now preparing to command a ship called the Endeavour, bound for places barely scribbled onto maps and sometimes only rumoured to exist, all because he could do math, didn't panic during cannon fire, and said "I" more convincingly than most. In short, Cook traded sheep for ships, a lateral move in the British economy perhaps, but a vertical one for history. His rise was not the result of noble birth or favoritism, it was the triumph of skill, stubbornness, and a personality best described as tolerably charismatic when absolutely necessary. From coal dust to command, James Cook began his journey as the most unlikely of legends, a working-class cartographer with a compass in one hand and destiny in the other. And as we'll see in the next chapter, that destiny involved a lot of water, a lot of maps, and more than a few disgruntled islanders. Before Google Earth, before atlases could be purchased with bonus coffee mugs, there was James Cook, a man who believed the world should be measured, labelled, and preferably named something British. If the last part was about Cook's escape from pickled fish and soot, then this part is where he picked up something far more useful than a grocer's apron. Cartography. That's right, map-making. The least sexy-sounding profession that somehow decided the fate of empires. Let's rewind to the mid-1750s, when Cook, now a Royal Navy man with ambition as deep as the ocean trenches, found himself stationed in North America during the 7 Years' War. While most soldiers were perfecting the art of cannonball dodging, Cook was out there with a compass and notebook, sketching coastlines like they owed him money. It turns out the British Navy valued maps just slightly less than rum, and Cook was about to become their favourite designated driver. Cook's big break came in Newfoundland, a rocky, foggy slab of coastline where the weather hates everyone equally. Most previous maps of the region were, well, let's call them interpretive art. Coastlines were guessed. Islands were either misplaced or imaginary. One French map even labelled a peninsula as possibly a sea serpent. But then Cook showed up with his sextant, quadrant, and the obsessive attention to detail usually reserved for medieval monks and IKEA instruction manuals. Over 9 grueling years in Newfoundland, Cook charted over 5,000 miles of coast with such mind-numbing precision that modern cartographers still nod approvingly at his work, before quietly realizing they've been outshone by a guy with no satellite imagery. His 1766 chart of the Strait of Belle Isle was so accurate, the British Admiralty used it well into the 20th century. That's 2 full centuries of naval officers saying, "Let's use the Cook map. The coastline hasn't moved." But how did he pull it off? Well, Cook combined scientific rigor with military discipline. He wasn't just eyeballing the waves, he used lunar distances to determine longitude, a technique so complex it makes algebra look like finger painting. He measured tides, took depth soundings, recorded magnetic variation, and probably would have mapped individual barnacles if given enough paper. Cook wasn't just drawing coastlines, he was building a playbook for empire. His charts weren't passive, they were aggressive tools of expansion. Each line and label said, "We've seen this rock, it's British now." His surveys helped the British Navy navigate waters they'd previously crashed into, while also sending an unsubtle message to France and Spain: "Our maps are better, and we're coming." What made Cook stand out wasn't just accuracy, it was reliability. His maps didn't just impress the Admiralty, they spoiled them. After Cook, anything less than perfection was unacceptable. It was like going from a hand-drawn treasure map to a turn-by-turn navigation system, only with a lot more sea spray and fewer sarcastic robots saying, "Recalculating." And while his peers were content drawing vague squiggles, Cook was labeling promontories, identifying safe anchorages, and noting prevailing winds. He basically created the maritime version of Yelp, except instead of reviews there were warnings like, "Don't sail here unless you enjoy shipwrecks and cold, miserable deaths." But here's the kicker. Cook wasn't formally trained as a scientist. He learned astronomy on his own. He read Isaac Newton's Principia like it was light bedtime reading. He was the ultimate DIY scholar, mixing Enlightenment-era curiosity with an alarming comfort around cannon fire. His maps weren't just pretty drawings, they were datasets wrapped in parchment and soaked in salt. And let's not forget the gear. While other officers treated telescopes like fashion accessories, Cook used his like a sniper uses a scope. He embraced the latest tech of the day. Portable observatories, timepieces called chronometers, think Rolex for nerds, and tools like theodolites that sound like ancient beasts but are actually for measuring angles. He traveled with scientists and surveyors, turning every expedition into a floating laboratory where science and navigation held hands and occasionally punched each other. In an age when most people thought the Earth was flattish and Australia might be full of dragons, Cook brought evidence, measurement, and relentless curiosity. His maps weren't just tools, they were symbols of a new era, where exploration wasn't about stumbling upon land by accident, but arriving on purpose, with a plan, a compass, and a slightly judgmental eyebrow. So the next time your GPS reroutes you mid-journey, think of James Cook, who mapped thousands of miles using nothing but the stars, some rope, and enough patience to make a Buddhist monk look twitchy. In 1768, a strange and ambitious vessel left English shores, a ship full of scientists, artists, sailors, and the ever-present waft of unwashed ambition. The HMS Endeavour wasn't just a floating science experiment, it was the Enlightenment strapped to a cannon with sails. And at the helm was Captain James Cook, a man whose childhood career prospects had included farming and maybe, if he was lucky, not dying of rickets. The mission? Observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, because 18th century astronomy was basically spy work, but for planets. The Royal Society wanted to record Venus crossing the Sun in the hope of calculating the distance between Earth and the Sun, using trigonometry and a lot of squinting. In theory, this would help refine global navigation. In practice, it meant dragging an entire ship across the globe to stare at a dot, for science. But this wasn't just a bunch of men with telescopes. The ship was also loaded with naturalists, artists, and curiosity collectors, including the now famous Joseph Banks, who brought with him a botanical appetite and a gentleman's ego the size of a man-o'-war. Banks wasn't there for naval discipline. He was there to find new plants, name them after himself, and occasionally complain about how the sailors smelled like old rum and rope. Also on board, artist Sidney Parkinson, who was tasked with painting everything from butterflies to battle wounds. His job was to make nature beautiful, even when it bit. He sketched marsupials, mapped palm trees, and occasionally had to draw someone mid-dysentery. Enlightenment wasn't glamorous. And then, of course, there was the rest of the crew, a mix of skilled seamen and barely housebroken deckhands, many of whom were missing more teeth than they had years left to live. Dental hygiene was optional, and scurvy was the inescapable mascot of any respectable ocean voyage. They survived on salted meat, questionable grog, and the fading memory of fresh vegetables. After a long and not-so-romantic journey through the Atlantic and around Cape Horn, known for waves that regularly tried to flip ships over like omelettes, the Endeavour reached Tahiti, where the crew was treated to a tropical paradise filled with people who understandably had no idea why a ship full of pale, wool-wearing men had just crashed their beach party. The observations of the transit of Venus went about as well as could be expected for 18th century science. Clouds, faulty instruments, and the realization that this entire mission might be scientifically inconclusive. Still, they took detailed notes, stared at the sky, and probably got a few sunburns that would have made a lobster blush. But the real meat of the journey came next. Cook decided to keep going. After all, why stop at one discovery when you can barge into entire continents? He sailed south in search of the mysterious Terra Australis Incognita, a mythical southern continent Europeans were convinced existed just to balance the planet. Science was creative back then. Instead of the lost continent, Cook found New Zealand, which he promptly mapped with surgical precision. The indigenous Maori, of course, had already been living there for centuries, and were not particularly thrilled about this sudden visitor who named their bays like he was decorating a catalogue. Then came Australia, where Cook famously discovered the east coast in 1770, an impressive feat considering the Aboriginal Australians had been living there for 65,000 years, give or take a few thousand. Cook landed at what would later be called Botany Bay, which Banks and his plant-happy crew treated like a botanical buffet. They catalogued over 30,000 plant specimens and possibly trampled a few sacred sites in the process. Despite these discoveries, there were also shipwrecks, disease outbreaks, and cultural misunderstandings aplenty. At one point, the Endeavour ran aground on the Great Barrier Reef, which no one had warned them about, probably because the reef didn't care to be charted. It took serious elbow grease, underwater patching, and probably a few sailor prayers shouted between curse words to keep the ship from becoming an expensive coral decoration. Eventually, with a patched hull and a hold full of plants, sketches, and sailors who had seen more sunsets than baths, Cook returned to England in 1771. He was hailed as a national hero, though the Maori, Aboriginal Australians, and Tahitians might have used different terms. His maps redefined geography, his journals inspired generations, and his crew, well, many of them got sick, lost limbs, or just quietly faded into the fog of history. But hey, Cook brought science to the Pacific, and yes, a few diseases, smallpox introductions, and cultural disruptions came along for the ride. Not every explorer brings souvenirs, some bring epidemics. So ends Cook's first voyage, a cocktail of discovery, imperialism, and Enlightenment optimism, shaken over a salty sea and served with a slice of pineapple stolen from a local island. The world would never look the same again. Captain James Cook had survived months of scientific observation, accidental island discoveries, and the increasingly tragic dental hygiene of the HMS Endeavour's crew, but as his ship sailed along the vast unknown eastern coast of Terra Australis in 1770, he was about to add a new experience to his resume: the thrilling pastime of running a nearly priceless Royal Navy vessel directly into a giant underwater death trap. But first, names. You see, when Cook charted the eastern coastline of the continent we now call Australia, he was basically playing a game of colonial bingo. With every new cape, bay, and rock that stuck out far enough to notice, Cook would slap a British name on it, like he was tagging clearance items at a yard sale. Bustard Bay, Cape Tribulation, Point Lookout, Mount Dismal. It was as if Cook was working through some personal issues with every geographical label. And then came the big one. After months of hugging the coast, mapping meticulously, and side-eyeing the occasional plume of smoke from Aboriginal fire signals, Cook pulled out the ultimate colonial power move. On August 20, 1770, were launched ashore at Possession Island and claimed the entire eastern coast of the continent for Britain. Because why not? There were barely 1,000 miles of forest, desert, and indigenous peoples in between him and the southern tip. And what did he name this massive stretch of land, home to civilization 65,000 years old? New South Wales. Why? Because it reminded him vaguely of South Wales, in Britain, a land famously full of hills, rain and sheep. Unlike the blistering beaches and eucalyptus forests Cook was now standing in, but accuracy was less important than branding. Hot, spiky Death Coast may have been more honest, but it wouldn't look nearly as regal on a parchment map. But the naming spree soon gave way to disaster. On June 11, 1770, while coasting along what is now Queensland, Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef. At night, in the middle of nowhere, with enough coral underneath to chew through the hull like a woodchipper on espresso. Suddenly, this was no longer a scientific voyage. It was an emergency plumbing situation, with the entire Pacific Ocean trying to get in. Cook's crew frantically tossed cannons overboard to lighten the ship. The carpenter worked furiously to plug the hole. A sailor was sent over the side to stuff a sail under the hull, a process called futhering, which sounds made up but isn't. Miraculously, it worked. Endeavour limped toward land and found temporary refuge in what would become Cooktown, named of course after himself. Because if you almost die in a place, it might as well carry your name. While repairs were underway, Cook and his crew had some of their first significant interactions with Aboriginal Australians, and by significant we mostly mean awkward. Communication was non-existent, cultural understanding was nil. The British offered gifts. The Aboriginals responded with wariness and occasional shouting. One man even hurled a spear, not exactly the warm welcome Cook may have envisioned, but understandable given the circumstances. Imagine someone barging into your backyard, planting a flag, and insisting it's now part of New South Wales. You'd throw something too. Cook, however, wrote about the locals with his usual blend of curiosity and condescension. He admired their resourcefulness, but described their lives as miserable, despite the fact that they were clearly surviving better than most of his scurvy-ridden crew. Cook's journals suggested a fascination with indigenous technology and hunting methods, but that didn't stop him from moving right along with his mission of claiming things and drawing neat borders around them. And so, patched up and perhaps slightly more cautious, Cook continued northward, skimming the coastline like a cartographic Roomba. Every cove, inlet and weird rock formation was added to his ever-expanding map, which by now looked like Britain's real estate brochure for global domination. By the time Cook returned to England in 1771, the map of Australia, or at least the eastern bit, had changed forever, and so had Britain's ambitions. Cook didn't know it yet, but his tidy cartographic lines would lay the groundwork for a full-scale invasion decades later. Convicts would follow, settlers would follow them, and the Aboriginal nations would endure wave after wave of forced displacement, disease and cultural erasure. But back in 1770, it was still just Cook, a badly dented ship, a lot of place names, and one very annoyed reef. Cook named things like a British dad on a road trip. He claimed land like a man who forgot to ask permission, and when he finally hit the reef, it was less of a glorious discovery and more of a glorious crash. Still, he sailed on, mapping the future, one awkward encounter and ridiculous name at a time. In 1772, James Cook did what any rational person who had nearly sunk off the Australian coast would do. He got back on a boat and sailed even farther into the unknown. This time, however, the mission wasn't palm trees and botany. It was ice. Lots and lots of it. His Majesty's government wanted Cook to solve a frigid riddle: the existence of Terra Australis Incognita, a supposed massive continent lurking somewhere at the bottom of the world. The only things standing in his way were cold, isolation, frostbite, and penguins who stared at him with the disdain of creatures who had mastered surviving the Antarctic long before humans brought charts and naval uniforms to the party. Cook's second voyage was no pleasure cruise. This was exploration with icicles attached. The ships, HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure, were specially outfitted to brave sub-zero temperatures, and the crew packed enough sauerkraut and malt to ward off scurvy and existential dread. Cook himself was promoted to commander, which in Royal Navy terms meant more paperwork, higher expectations, and even fewer people willing to question your increasingly frostbitten decisions. The journey took them deep into the Southern Ocean, a vast uncharted expanse of wet nothingness, occasionally interrupted by howling winds and chunks of floating death. Unlike his first voyage, which featured tropical islands and sunburns, this expedition was a constant test of hull integrity and morale. Sea ice formed overnight. The sails crackled with frost. Seawater froze mid-splash. If you wanted paradise, this wasn't it. If you wanted to question your life choices while staring at grey skies and wondering if toes were optional, you'd found your Eden. Cook pushed farther south than any human had ever dared, crossing the Antarctic Circle, not once, not twice, but 3 times. In a time before central heating, thermal underwear, or even a firm understanding of hypothermia, this was borderline madness disguised as empire building. His men suffered through sleet, gales, and isolation, but Cook remained laser-focused. He was determined to find this southern continent the maps kept whispering about, because apparently, if there was a blank spot on the globe, 18th century Europeans simply couldn't sleep until they'd put a flag on it. The mythical Terra Australis, though, stubbornly refused to show up. What Cook did find was a continent-sized serving of disappointment, and a great deal of floating icebergs that looked a bit too eager to introduce themselves to the hull. Trachiest landmass was Antarctica, which he almost reached but never saw due to constant fog and blizzards. Still, Cook charted thousands of miles of previously unknown ocean, solidified the understanding that Terra Australis, at least as a massive southern landmass, probably didn't exist, and earned the eternal envy of every future mapmaker. His charts were so precise, they were still in use well into the 20th century. He made the middle of nowhere navigable, a bit like mapping a desert and making it look like a road trip destination. Of course, there was also the business of keeping everyone alive, a tall order when your travel companions include icebergs and months-long stretches without seeing land. But Cook had learned from past maritime disasters and implemented strict hygiene, diet, and discipline on board. The result? A crew that mostly stayed healthy, if deeply sick of salted meat and boiled peas. Notably, Cook's focus on preventing scurvy became legendary. While other ships rotted from the inside out, his crew munched citrus like their lives depended on it, which, to be fair, they did. Meanwhile, interactions with the indigenous peoples of the Pacific during this voyage were fewer and far between. The icy trajectory of the journey meant fewer island visits and more prolonged staring contests with glaciers. But where land was encountered, like at South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, Cook did what any European captain would in his boots. He named them, planted a flag, and didn't ask who might have already known they existed. By the end of the voyage, Cook returned not with tales of rich lands or golden cities, but with something arguably more valuable. Proof that the Earth's southern reaches were more ocean than continent, more ice than empire. It was a triumph of logic over legend, science over speculation. Not that everyone back in England appreciated the subtlety. After all, you can't plunder frozen water. You can, however, admire how annoyingly correct the man with the charts turned out to be. In the end, Cook didn't discover a hidden southern continent, but he did discover that penguins don't care about British flags, that frostbite has no sense of humour, and that sometimes the true reward of exploration is simply ruling out the nonsense. He mapped the impossible and came back with sanity, mostly intact, though one suspects the crew had a few icy opinions of their own. Captain James Cook may have started out as a talented cartographer with a curious mind and a compass that never took a day off, but by the time his boots hit enough beaches, The image of heroic explorer began to erode like a coastline in a storm. For every shipmate singing his praises, there was an indigenous community left wondering who invited the man in the fancy hat and socks that smelled like mildew. Welcome to the not-so-glamorous flip side of exploration: colonization, cultural clashes, and the arrival of diseases that weren't exactly RSVP'd. Let's start with the myth. Cook, the Enlightenment-era gentleman explorer, bearer of telescopes, notebooks, and a desire to advance science and understanding. And to be fair, he did do all of that. He charted unknown coastlines, brought back detailed records of flora and fauna, and expanded European knowledge of the world by a few very large oceans. To Britain, he was a national treasure wrapped in navy wool. To the Royal Society, he was a brilliant field agent of reason and progress. But to many of the people Cook encountered on his voyages, he was something else entirely, a harbinger of things that came on boats and stayed for centuries. Let's unpack it. Cook's interactions with indigenous populations weren't just awkward. They were the opening scenes of what would become long and often devastating colonial dramas. His first contact with Maori in New Zealand on the Endeavour voyage, as you may remember, this was the trip involving botanists. The transit of Venus and several buckets of salted meat started badly. Language barriers and cultural misunderstandings quickly led to violence. Cook shot several Maori during his time there, claiming self-defense or confusion. But let's just say it didn't exactly lay the foundation for a cheerful alliance. Later, in Australia, Cook and his crew made landfall at Botany Bay and noted that the Aboriginal Australians didn't seem especially interested in trading with them. The indigenous people, who had been there for over 60,000 years, didn't need what Cook was offering. They had their own systems of food, knowledge, and culture, and didn't require pickled pork or trinkets in exchange for their land. Yet Cook claimed the east coast of Australia for Britain anyway, declaring it terra nullius, land belonging to no one, despite the actual humans living there, who might have had a differing opinion. In the Pacific Islands, Cook often presented himself as a peaceful envoy, someone who wanted to learn from the people he encountered, and sometimes he did just that. But he also brought firearms, European arrogance, and pathogens that had been partying in European lungs for centuries. To the islanders, first contact quickly turned into first influenza, and the arrival of these ships meant a rapid and catastrophic drop in population due to diseases like smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis. And here's the kicker: Cook didn't just stumble into these places on his own wild curiosity. He was backed by empire. Every flag he planted wasn't just a decorative flourish, it was a statement. His meticulous maps made it easier for Britain to come back, stake claims and start setting up shop. Plantations, penal colonies, missionaries and traders followed in his wake, often disrupting or replacing indigenous systems of governance, culture and trade. In many places, Cook's name is still a loaded one. Statues of him have been defaced. Debates rage about whether he should be honored or criticized, and local histories often tell a very different story than the one you'd find in a British naval archive. He was a man of his time, yes, but that time included colonial conquest wrapped in the velvet cloak of scientific endeavor. Cook may not have pulled the strings, but his voyages gave those strings a whole lot more reach. To the Enlightenment world, he was a living embodiment of reason, bravery, and intellect. To indigenous communities, he was more of an uninvited guest who brought chaos, sometimes wrapped in curiosity. It's the complex legacy of someone who could chart a coastline to the inch, but failed to understand the depth of the cultural oceans he was sailing into. Let's not forget, when Cook first arrived in Hawaii, he was greeted as a god, quite literally. He arrived during a festival celebrating Lono, a deity associated with peace and fertility. Cook, pale, oddly dressed, and sailing a massive wooden island with billowing cloth, was mistaken for something divine. But as he returned again and again, wore out his welcome, and responded to resistance with violence, the mood soured. Eventually they saw the man behind the myth, and saw that he wasn't a god at all. He was a sailor with too many demands and too little respect. So was Cook a brilliant explorer? Yes, Was he also the beginning of centuries of upheaval for the places he discovered? Also yes. To some, he's a genius. To others, just an overachieving tourist with dangerous baggage. Captain James Cook's third and final voyage was less 3-hour tour and more globe-trotting game of cold and hot potato. By this time, Cook was already something of a celebrity among mapmakers, monarchs, and men who loved unnecessarily long sea voyages. But rather than enjoy his semi-retirement with a stiff drink and a star chart, he got handed a new mission: find the elusive Northwest Passage, the mythical maritime shortcut from the Pacific to the Atlantic, or as Cook probably called it after a few weeks, the frostbitten fool's errand. In 1776, Cook set sail aboard HMS Resolution, joined by HMS Discovery, in search of the Northwest Passage, a shipping route that had driven explorers mad for centuries. The British Admiralty still clung to the hope that such a route would turn the Pacific into a British lake and eliminate the need to awkwardly go around South America or Africa with their pesky coastlines and inconvenient alliances. Spoiler, Cook didn't find it. But what he did find was an Arctic experience so miserable that penguins would have filed formal complaints. Sailing up the west coast of North America, past what we now know as Oregon, British Columbia, and Alaska, Cook entered the Bering Strait with all the enthusiasm of a man trying to force open a freezer with his bare hands. Icebergs loomed like floating tombstones, the temperatures dropped faster than morale, and the sailors, many of whom had signed up for Pacific palm trees and friendly locals, were instead rewarded with sub-zero winds and the unmistakable smell of wet wool and regret. Navigating icy waters in wooden ships is like trying to parallel park a piano on a glacier. Hulls creaked, frost formed on eyebrows, and any attempt to sail further north was blocked by an ocean that had decided to become a solid. One sailor noted that even the rigging of the ship froze, which made climbing the masts feel less like nautical duty and more like a punishment from Norse gods. Cook pushed further than any European had before in the Arctic, a noble effort, assuming you define noble as sailing directly into nature's cold shoulder and stubbornly staying there. Eventually, even the notoriously stubborn Cook had to concede. The Northwest Passage was not going to be found with the help of 18th century wooden vessels and frostbitten optimism. He turned south, likely muttering under his breath about ice, hallucinating about the warmth of Polynesian breezes and roasted pork. His return to Hawaii, which he had previously visited en route to the Arctic, was meant to be a reprieve, and for a time it was. The crew arrived to the islands during the Makahiki Festival, a season of peace and prosperity dedicated to the god Lono. By sheer coincidence, Cook's arrival coincided with the timing of the festivities, and his ship, with its towering masts and white sails, resembled the prophesied return of Lono. Talk about arriving on brand. For a few glorious weeks, Cook and his men were treated like deities. They were showered with gifts, honored with feasts, and even allowed to wander freely among the villages, a rare kindness for outsiders. The crew responded the only way 18th century sailors knew how, by overindulging, overstaying, and slowly wearing out their welcome. Eventually, Cook departed, but not for long. Just a few days after leaving, the Resolution suffered a broken mast. Cook, much to the dismay of the Hawaiians, returned. And this is where paradise got prickly. The second arrival wasn't greeted with garlands and goodwill. Suspicion had replaced ceremony. Resources were strained, tempers flared, and Cook, once calm and methodical, began acting erratically. Some historians believe the years at sea had finally taken their toll, and that the stress, cold, and constant conflict had frayed even Cook's iron discipline. When a small Hawaiian boat was stolen, Cook made the fatal mistake of trying to kidnap the local chief in retaliation, a tactic borrowed from naval protocol but profoundly tone-deaf in the face of Hawaiian customs. What followed was chaos. A scuffle broke out, voices rose, spears were raised, and in the surf of Kealakekua Bay on February 14, 1779, the man who had sailed further than nearly any explorer in history was killed, clubbed and stabbed by islanders who had once honored him as a god, but now saw him as an invasive threat. Cook's body was partially returned by the Hawaiians after the violence, an act of respect amid tragedy, but much was lost to the waves and fire. His crew left Hawaii soon after, their mission incomplete, their captain gone, and the myth of invincibility shattered. Cook's third voyage was a mixture of cold ambition and cultural missteps. He went searching for a mythical passage and found a hard reality. Not every frontier wants to be charted, not every people want to be visited, and not every explorer lives to see the end of their map. From the Arctic's frozen silence to Hawaii's volcanic heat, this chapter of Cook's journey wasn't just the end of a voyage, it was the beginning of a long debate. Where do we draw the line between discovery and intrusion? Still, if nothing else, he proved one universal truth. Just because you can sail somewhere doesn't always mean you should. When Captain James Cook first arrived on the big island of Hawaii in 1779, the timing couldn't have been more perfect or more doomed. It was Makahiki season, a sacred time in Hawaiian culture dedicated to peace, prosperity, and the worship of the god Lono. Cook, with his oddly timed arrival, tall ships and billowing white sails, just so happened to resemble Lono's traditional image, an accidental cosplay that earned him a divine welcome. The locals offered food, gifts, and elaborate ceremonies. The crew, having just come from the frozen nightmare that was the Arctic, must have thought they'd landed in paradise, and for a while it certainly looked that way. But being mistaken for a god is a tricky business. It's all divine parades and roasted pigs until you try to stick around after the honeymoon phase. Cook enjoyed the attention, basking in the reverence with a healthy British glow of entitlement. His crew, meanwhile, was busy enjoying the tropical fruits of heaven literally and figuratively. But gods, especially imported ones, are expected to behave a certain way. Unfortunately, Cook soon began acting less like a deity and more like a cranky supply manager with a superiority complex. After a month of enjoying divine status and presumably coconuts in quantities that bordered on absurd, Cook and his crew set sail, but not for long. Damage to the Resolution's foremast forced them to turn back, an awkward return that, in mythological terms, was the equivalent of dying and undying in front of your worshippers. It broke the illusion. Lono wasn't supposed to need spare parts. The crowd that once greeted them with garlands now met them with skepticism. This wasn't the god they were looking for. This was a mortal with ship problems and boundary issues. Tensions mounted quickly. The British, once revered, now seemed demanding and aggressive. Cook, frustrated and increasingly ill-tempered, began to treat diplomacy like a checklist written in cannon fire. He wanted repairs. He wanted supplies. He wanted deference, and when he didn't get it, he responded like a man used to getting his way by escalating the situation in the worst possible way. The final straw came when Cook, in a move that can only be described as colonial hubris on full display, attempted to kidnap Kalaniʻaupua, the ruling chief of Hawaii. Yes, he tried to kidnap a king. The logic was baffling. Hold the chief hostage, get what he wanted, sail away into history. Unfortunately for Cook, the Hawaiians didn't see it that way. They gathered in force, tensions boiled over, and in the chaos, Cook was killed, stabbed and clubbed to death near the water's edge. The would-be god ended his days face down in the surf, brought low by the very people who had once welcomed him as a divine being. The aftermath was no less complicated. The Hawaiians, showing remarkable cultural respect, treated Cook's body with rituals appropriate for high-ranking individuals. Parts of his remains were eventually returned to his crew, who sailed away in silence, stunned by the collapse of what should have been a peaceful encounter. The British narrative tried to paint Cook as a martyr. Others saw the tragedy for what it was, a cautionary tale of cultural arrogance, poor diplomacy, and the dangers of believing your own legend. Cook's downfall in Hawaii serves as a turning point in his story, marking the end of his third and final voyage. It also leaves a complicated legacy. To some, he was a brilliant explorer and map-maker. To others, a harbinger of colonial intrusion. And in Hawaii, he remains a deeply controversial figure, part myth, part menace, and entirely mortal in the end. From divine misidentification to fatal confrontation, This reminds us that even the most revered explorers were just human, and sometimes they were very, very bad at reading the room. By early 1779, James Cook had officially overstayed his welcome in Hawaii. What began as a divine arrival had unraveled into a messy, tension-filled stay that had more in common with a diplomatic incident than a homecoming. After his ship, HMS Resolution, limped back to Kealakekua Bay due to storm damage, the atmosphere among the Hawaiians had notably shifted. The air of awe was gone, the locals had seen behind the curtain, and what remained was a grumpy Englishman demanding lumber like he was in charge of a particularly aggressive home renovation project. The final spark that set everything ablaze was, appropriately, something small and thoroughly British: a stolen boat. One of Resolution's cutters disappeared, taken by Hawaiians, likely as leverage or as a response to Cook's increasingly arrogant behavior. Cook, never one to respond calmly when things didn't go his way, decided that the best course of action was to take Chief Kalaniʻaopu hostage until the boat was returned. This was not an unfamiliar colonial tactic. Hostage diplomacy, as it might generously be called, had been used before in other parts of the Pacific, but in this case, it was disastrously misjudged. Cook, accompanied by a handful of Marines, marched to the chief's residence and attempted to escort him to the British ships. Kalaniʻaopu, confused but cooperative, went along at first, likely out of courtesy or sheer curiosity. But news of the situation spread quickly, and soon a large group of Hawaiian villagers assembled on the beach, angry and alarmed. The tide had quite literally turned. At this point, Cook still seemed to believe he could talk his way out of it. Even as hundreds gathered and tempers flared, his men were nervous. The villagers were shouting. The chief's wife, recognizing what was happening, pleaded with her husband not to go with the foreigners. Her cries acted like a signal. The tension snapped. It's hard to say exactly what Cook was thinking. Perhaps he still believed in his untouchability, that his status as a great explorer or ex-god, depending on who you asked, would protect him. Instead, what followed was chaos. A scuffle broke out near the water's edge. Cook fired his musket, though whether he hit anyone is still debated. What's certain is that the Hawaiians retaliated immediately and with force. Cook was struck from behind, clubbed, and then stabbed repeatedly. He fell face first into the surf he had once ruled with confident strides. He died not as an explorer or a commander, but as a man caught in a whirlwind of cultural misunderstanding and colonial arrogance. The irony was thick. Cook, who had sailed across the globe, navigating dangerous reefs and surviving near mutinies, was ultimately undone by his failure to grasp the human temperature of a place he'd already visited. He could chart coastlines with immaculate precision, but missed the giant red flags waving in front of his face. After all, the man who could calculate longitude to within a hair's breadth still thought kidnapping the local chief was a winning strategy. In the immediate aftermath, Cook's men retrieved what they could of his remains. The Hawaiians, adhering to their own customs, treated his body with a kind of ceremonial care. Bones cleaned, flesh burned, and relics eventually returned. The British saw this as barbaric desecration. The Hawaiians likely saw it as giving Cook the kind of honored treatment reserved for important people. It was, in its own complex way, a gesture of respect, just not the kind Cook had hoped for. Back in Britain, Cook's death sent shockwaves through the public. The image of the fearless navigator, struck down by savages, played well with imperial sentiment. Paintings were commissioned, monuments were planned, his journals were published and widely read, cementing his reputation as a national hero. But over time, the story grew less one-sided. In the Pacific, especially among Hawaiians and indigenous groups of New Zealand and Australia, Cook's legacy became harder to praise. Yes, he mapped uncharted waters, but he also brought disease, violence, and the first tremors of colonialism. In many ways, his death was both a tragic finale and a metaphor. A man who had risen to almost mythic status, called a god, treated as a prophet, was ultimately felled by the very people he failed to understand. It wasn't the sea or a storm that ended him, it was his own hubris. Cook died not in triumph, but in a cautionary tale, soaked in salt water, and wrapped in the complexities of cultural collision. So while James Cook may have conquered maps, he never quite conquered common sense, and for all the miles he charted, all the discoveries he made, his final mistake was both simple and fatal. He forgot that people, unlike coastlines, don't stay still and don't take kindly to being taken. Captain James Cook didn't just sail off the edge of the map, he redrew it. Thousands of miles of previously uncharted coastlines were suddenly transformed into neatly inked outlines on parchment. He connected dots, named things often redundantly, and made the Pacific a little less mysterious for 18th century Europeans. But while the British Empire built statues in his honor, many of the people he encountered, or whose descendants came to feel the ripple effects of his voyages, built something else entirely: resentment. In the sanitized history textbooks of old, Cook was the golden boy of Enlightenment-era exploration, a self-made man who rose from humble beginnings to become the cartographer of empires. A scientific adventurer with a compass in one hand and a barometer in the other. He wasn't conquering lands, the narrative insisted. He was discovering them. That is, until you start listening to the people who were already living on those lands, who might have a few notes. For indigenous communities across the Pacific, Cook wasn't a trailblazer. He was the unwanted houseguest who showed up, renamed everything, left his muddy boots on the spiritual welcome mat, and invited his empire to follow behind with muskets, missionaries and measles. In Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii and beyond, Cook's arrival often signaled the beginning of colonial pressure, cultural upheaval, and for many, the loss of sovereignty. Not exactly a recipe for warm remembrance. Still, to his fans, and oh yes, he has plenty, Cook is the model of rational Enlightenment exploration. He gathered botanical specimens, made astronomical observations, and introduced a kind of structured naval discipline that, by the standards of the 18th century, wasn't entirely awful. He battled scurvy with sauerkraut and kept logs so meticulous you could practically hear the creak of the ship through the ink. He didn't always bring war with him, but he always brought knowledge, and depending on your viewpoint, that either redeems him slightly or damns him further. And then there are the statues. Erected across the globe from Sydney to Anchorage, they depict Cook in a pose that screams, "I just discovered this place you've been living on for 10,000 years. In recent decades, these monuments have been defaced, toppled, spray-painted with phrases like "no pride in genocide" or "decolonize." For some, tearing down Cook is symbolic catharsis, an act of reclaiming space and rejecting imperial narratives. For others, it's vandalism of a national hero. For Cook himself, well, it's probably very confusing from the afterlife. But perhaps it's this tension that defines his legacy more accurately than either end of the hero-villain binary. Cook is a man whose achievements can't be denied, but neither can their consequences. He was both brilliant and blinkered, brave and arrogant, a man who could read the stars with precision but not always the room. He sailed into the unknown and took the world with him, whether it wanted to come along or not. His charts revolutionized navigation. His name is etched on coastlines, ships and schools, but he also paved the way, intentionally or not, for centuries of imperial dominance. His voyages didn't just connect the globe, they set off chains of events that reshaped entire societies, often through disease, dispossession and disruption. So what do we do with Captain Cook today? Celebrate him? Condemn him? Add a very long footnote? Maybe the best approach is to view him with the same complexity he brought to the maps, full of detail, nuance, and the occasional dangerous reef hidden just below the surface. Cook wasn't a one-dimensional villain, nor was he a flawless hero. When he was, in many ways, the embodiment of his age, curious, calculating, and occasionally catastrophic. He made the world smaller and more connected, but for many, he also made it more painful. As for how history remembers him, that depends on who's holding the pen or the spray paint.